Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. This is your boy Riddell. This is the Purple Political Breakdown, where we try to find political solutions without political bias. And this is just one of those conversations that embody exactly what I'm talking about. We have Ben Shapiro versus Destiny. We have someone from the right, from the left. That two individuals on, from what I've seen, their opinions I respect, considering the nuance that they try to go through in terms of the lens that they're going through. Now, I don't agree with everything they're saying, but their perspective is something I definitely respect, of course. So this is a conversation people have been wanting for a very, very long time, and I'm gonna lock in. I'm gonna dive right into it. I'm gonna skip the introductions and just go right into it. It is 2 hours and 20 minutes, so we're going to playback speed 1.25, and let's dive in.
Ben, you're a conservative. Destiny, you're a liberal. Can you each describe what key values underpin your philosophy on politics and maybe life in the context of this left-right political spectrum? You want to go first?
Yeah. So I think that we have a huge country full of a lot of people, a lot of individual talents, capabilities. And I think that the goal of government, broadly speaking, should be to try to ensure that everybody's able to achieve as much as possible. So on a liberal level, that
I'm gonna
usually means
try
some
not
people
to
might
pause
need a
too
little bit of a
much.
boost when it comes to things like education. They might need a little bit of a boost when it comes to providing certain necessities like housing or food or clothing. But broadly speaking, I mean, I'm still a liberal, not a communist or socialist. I don't believe in the total command economy,
This is
total
2 hours and
communist
20
takeover
minutes.
of
This is
all of
gonna be
the
a long
economy.
video, but
But I
this is
think that
just one
broadly
of those
speaking, government's got to
videos
kick in and help
that
people when
I'm
they
genuinely
need it.
interested
And that
to see the
government
entire
can and should be
conversation.
big.
Not necessarily. I noticed that when liberals talk about government, or especially taxes, it seems like they talk about it for taxes' sake or bigness sake. So people talk about
I'm
taxes like
sorry,
they're
I'm gonna
just
have
like
to turn
a
it down
punishment.
because I
Tax
don't
the
want to
rich.
pause. I'm just gonna
I
have
think
to
taxing
talk
the rich
over
is
a little
fine
bit.
insofar as it funds the programs that we want to fund. But Democrats have a really big problem demonizing success or wealth, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing to be wealthy, to be a billionaire or whatever, as long as we're funding what we need to fund.
Ben, what do you think it means to be a conservative? What's the philosophy?
For liberal, I mean, I'm not mad at what Destiny says. Like I said, it's very nuanced. Like he understands what the liberal philosophy is trying to do, but at the same time understands that there are components of the society that are deemed very negative inherently, but are automatically more in a gray area. Like billionaires are not automatically bad. It's just how they use their resources is what's important.
That underlies your political view.
So first of all, I'm glad that Destiny, you're already coming out as Republican. That's exciting. I mean, we hold a lot in common in terms of, the basic idea that people ought to have as much opportunity as possible, and also insofar as the government should do the minimum amount necessary to interfere in people's lives.
It's funny that Ben Shapiro is just not wearing like a suit. Like I feel like in his early days he would always wear a suit, but he's just like leather jacket, gray shirt,
certain
okay,
functions, particularly at the local level.
yarmulke.
So a lot of governmental discussions on a pragmatic level end up being discussions about where government ought to be involved, but also at what level government ought to be involved. And I have an incredibly subsidiary view of government. I think that local governments, because you have higher levels of homogeneity and consent, are capable of doing more things. And as you abstract up the chain, it becomes more and more impractical and more divisive to do more things. In my view, government is basically there to preserve certain key liberties. Those key liberties pre-exist the government insofar as they are more important than what priorities the government has. The job of government is to maintain, for example, national defense, protection of property rights, protection of religious freedom. Right? These are the key focuses of government as generally expressed in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And I agree with the general philosophy of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't do more on a governmental level, again, as you get closer to the ground, which, by the way, is also embedded in the Constitution. People forget the Constitution was originally applied to the federal government, not to local and state governments. But if I were going to define conservatism, it would actually be a little broader than that, because I think to understand how people interact with government, you have to go to kind of core values. And so for me, there are a couple of premises. One, human beings have a nature. That nature is neither good nor bad. We have aspects of goodness and we have aspects of badness. Human beings are sinful. We have temptations. And what that means is that we have to be careful not to incentivize the bad, and that we should incentivize the good. Human beings do have agency and are capable of making decisions in the vast majority of circumstances. And it is better for society if we act as though they do. Second, the basic idea of human nature, there is an idea, in my view, that all human beings have equal value before the law. Yeah, I'm a religious person, so I'd say equal value before God. But I think that's also sort of a key tenet of Western civilization, being non-religious or religious, that every individual has equivalent value in sort of cosmic terms. But that does not necessarily mean that every person is equally equipped to do everything equally well. And so it is not the job of government to rectify every imbalance of life. The quest for cosmic justice, as Thomas Sowell suggests, is something that government is generally incapable of doing, and more often than not botches and makes things worse. So those are a few key tenets, and that tends to materialize in a variety of ways. The easiest way to sum that up would the traditional kind of three legs of the conservative stool, although now obviously there's a very fragmented conservative movement in the United States, would be a socially conservative view in which family is the chief institution of society, like the little platoons of society,
Socially
as Edmund Burke
conservative.
suggested,
Okay.
in which free markets and property rights are extraordinarily valuable and necessary, because every individual has the ability to be creative with their property and to freely alienate that property. And finally, I tend toward a hawkish foreign policy that suggests that the world is not filled with wonderful people who all agree with us and think like us, and those people will pursue adversarial interests if we do not protect our own interests.
Can I ask you a question?
Fair,
So,
Yeah, sure,
fair.
sure.
I'm excited for this conversation because I consider you to be really intelligent. But I feel like sometimes there are ways that conservatives talk about certain issues that seem to defy logic and reason, I guess. So here, and I'm sure you feel the same way about well, I feel the same way about progressives, but even some liberals for sure. Before I ask this question, it's going to relate to education. We can agree, broadly speaking, that statistics are real and that not everybody could do everything. So for a grounded example, my life was pretty bad. I got into streaming and I turned my life around, and that was really cool. But I can't expect everybody to do what I did, right? Like everybody being able to join the NBA or to be like a
Looks like they're about to go to the component of liberalism and conservatism and the approach to the American dreams, and it looks like is where Destiny's trying to go to. But
That's
let's
true.
hear
Well,
it
of
out.
course, everybody
Yeah,
has different
sure.
qualities. Sure.
Okay. So I used to be a lot more libertarian when I was 21. And one of the things that dramatically changed kind of my view on government manipulation of things in the, I guess, in society came when it came time to deal with my son and the school that he went to. And one of the things that I noticed was when it came time to send my son to school, I could do private education or I could do public. Personally, I did 12 years of Catholic private education. However, the public schools in Nebraska, depending on where you lived, were very, very, very good. And I opted for a certain district. I bought a house there. I moved there. And then my son was able to go to those schools. And he's been going through those schools. And the difference of availability of like technology, like these kids are taking home iPads in like first grade. They've got like
Going
huge computer labs and everything.
education route.
Do you think that there is some type of, I don't want to say injustice or unfairness, because I'm not even looking at it that way, just pragmatically, that there might be children that are in certain schools that if they just had better funding or more access to technologies or things available to them, that those kids would become more productive members of society, that with like a little bit of a help, they could actually achieve more and do better for all of society?
So I think
This is a very huge thing. I'm gonna let them talk. Don't worry, I'm gonna let them talk. But I think that's such a huge component in terms of the conversation of society. There's layers to where America should put their focus on, and education and the way the children grow up, it should be one of the top priorities. So
that on the
well,
list of
could be-
priorities when it comes to education,
Mhm.
the availability of technology is actually fairly low on the list of priorities.
Sure. The
Meaning
two
that
things
the-
I've heard are food availability and I think air conditioning, I think are the two biggest ones that I hear, but sure.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing in terms of education itself, not just the physical facilities that we're talking about,
Mhm.
would actually be two-parent family households.
Sure.
Communities that have fathers in them is
Sure.
actually the number one, decisive according to Roland Fryer and many studies done on this particular topic.
Mhm.
And the idea that money alone, that investment of resources is the top priority in schooling is belied by the fact that LAUSD, which is where I went to school when I was younger,
Mhm.
they pour an enormous amount of money into LAUSD. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars very often per student,
Mhm.
and it does not result in better schooling outcomes. And so when you say, if we could give every kid an iPad, would you give every kid an iPad? The question is not, if I had a replicator machine from Star Trek, would I give everybody an enormous amount of stuff? Sure, I would. Every resource is finite. Every resource is limited, and you have to prioritize what are the outcomes that you seek in terms of the means with which you are seeking them.
Mhm.
And so, again, I think that the question is I quibble with the premise of the question, which is that again, the chief injustice when it comes to education on the list of injustices is lack of availability to technology or that it's a funding problem. I just don't think that's the case.
Sure. And I can half agree with you there, but I don't think any
I mean, I hear what Ben's saying. I think for the most part, when it comes down to it, we do have to understand that certain resources given to certain schools doesn't allow them to bring out the full potential of the kids at the same time, which maybe Destiny is going to bring up. But the culture at the home is valid, but just because you have a father and a mother doesn't necessarily mean that the kid is going to be growing up if they're not attentive. It just requires that extra step. The attentiveness of the parents, the father figure, and his ability to rule or, discipline, of course, set a kind of framework of the kid growing up in a normal, a comfortable, a not progressive, but in a growing matter, of course. But I mean, I think the family home is just one component for sure.
Amount of changes in the schools will create two-parent households, right? We can't bring it.
I totally agree
Yeah.
with you.
So
That's why I think that the fundamental educational problem is not, in fact, a schooling problem. I think that it pre-exists that.
sure, but then I feel like I feel like this is kind of the conservative merry-go-round where it's like, what can we do to help with schools? So two of the things that I've seen, I think that are
Yeah, I'm
usually
with
brought up in research is
Destiny. We
one is
gotta
air conditioning, that children in hotter environments just don't learn as well. And then the second one is
Fair.
access to food. So like kids that are given like a breakfast or a lunch that's provided at school, like increases educational outcomes. Now I agree that neither of these things might be determinative in like, well, 20% of kids are graduating, now 80% of kids are graduating, or these kids are all going, from
Air conditioning, yeah, in terms of the comfortability of the learning environment, the focus should be the kid should be as comfortable as possible so they can reroute all their thoughts and their mental power towards the information that they're consuming. Distractions limit that, of course. As for food, I mean, I never ate breakfast at school, but lunch is automatic, 100%.
with their GEDs into the workforce, and now these kids are all suddenly becoming engineers. But in terms of where we can help, do you think there should be like some minimum threshold or minimum baseline of like, at the very least, every school should have a non-leaky gym, or every school should have, if children can't afford lunch or breakfast, like some sort of food provided, or every school should have these like baseline things?
So again, I'm going to quibble with the premise of the question because I
Sure.
think that when it comes to, for example, food insecurity, school food programs,
Mhm.
again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's
Sure.
no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is how large is the margin and how big is the movement, right? So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework, what are the incentive structures we can set up for a society that actually facilitate that, how local communities take ownership of their schools is a big one, right? All of these issues we're ignoring in favor of, say, air conditioning or lunch programs. And so in a vacuum, if you say air conditioning and lunch programs, sounds great in a vacuum. In terms of prioritization of values and cost structure, are those the things that I think are going to move the needle in a major way in terms of public policy? I do not. And in fact, I think that many of them end up being disproportionate wastes of money. I mean, I've talked before pretty controversially about the fact that an enormous amount of school lunch programs are thrown out. Like an enormous amount of that food ends up in the garbage can. Is there a better way to do that? If there is a better way to do it, then I'm perfectly willing to hear about that better way to do it. But it seems to me that one of the big flaws in the way that many
That's
people
fair. That's
of the
fair.
left approach government is what if we hit every gnat with a hammer? And my question is, what if the gnat isn't even the problem? What if there's a much bigger substructure problem that needs to be solved in order to, if you're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, sure, you can make the Titanic slightly more balanced because the deck chairs are slightly better oriented. But the real question is the water that's gaping into the Titanic, right?
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. But again, I feel like we're on the conservative merry-go-round then of never wanting to address as
That's not
any.
conservative merry-go-round. I can give you 10 ways.
Well, sure, but so like here would be the merry-go-round.
I'm interested in hearing Shapiro's like solutions, but at the same time, I think I know where Des is coming from. What is the tangible thing we can start doing as a society that we can implement that will be helpful? Changing a mindset is something intrinsic, and that's something that you can try to reinforce as a individual to another individual, but you can't guarantee that change at the family structure. So there's a disconnect where Destiny's talking about the tangible things that we can do and implement in terms of policy that would benefit kids in education. Shapiro is talking about the culture, the intangible stuff, the mindset, the community. Like, yes, but you only can tell a person so many stuff to do. Whether they do it or not is up to them. But what we can do is change certain things at the schools and implement certain programs that will be beneficial for the growth of children. So think
I would
that's
say that
important.
like there's a minimum funding for schools that I think would help children, and then we go, well, the thing that would help them the most is two-parent households. And I go, okay, well, two-parent households actually aren't the problem. The issue is access to things like birth controls that people don't have children early on. And it's like, but the issue isn't actually birth control. The issue is actually you need a certain amount of money to move out early and to get married and then to have a two-parent household. So it's actually like economic opportunity.
No.
Well, it's not,
No, just two-parent households. That's
yeah,
it.
but like, what are the
Don't
precursors
fuck people
for?
before you're married and have babies.
Sure,
Done.
that's great. We can say that and try to fight against, however many hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, but people will have sex and people will make babies.
And then they used to get married. The vast majority of people in this country with kids used to be married. The vast majority of people with kids in this country
Sure.
now are not married increasingly.
Mhm.
That
But
is
a lot of
obviously a
the
societal change.
yeah,
Something
true.
changed. It wasn't human evolution.
But a lot of those things in terms of resting on whether or not people get married have to do with financial decisions. Do you have the money?
People are worse off now than they were 50, 60 years ago when the marriage rates were higher.
People are delaying the start of their careers because education is going to be increasingly important.
So, in other words, people are richer now and they have more education now, and yet they're having more babies out of wedlock now because they're richer and have more education.
I'm saying that one of the biggest indicators for whether or not somebody's willing to get married is how much money both people are making if they can move out of their household. People don't tend to want to get married at 22 when they've just finished college, when they don't have the money to move out and they can't afford a house.
Because we have changed the moral status of marriage in the culture, meaning that everyone, poor, rich, and in between, used to get married. That is, by the way, a huge percentage of marriages in the United States used to be what they would call shotgun marriages, meaning that somebody knocked somebody up, and because they did not want the baby to be born outside of a two-parent household, they would then get married.
Do we think that shotgun marriages, though, are a way to bring back equilibrium to education?
Yes.
That if we,
Yes, absolutely. Yes, 100%.
Do we
a
think
child
that-
deserves a mother and a father?
Sure,
Because that is the basis for all of this, including education.
do we think that shotgun marriages are
I think I feel like Ben Shapiro in this conversation is too reliant on a baseline structure that ultimately I hear you, like a two-parent household is better than a one-parent household, but a two-parent household doesn't automatically mean the best for the kids. And I think Destiny's gonna go into it. I'm gonna let him.
well, let's say this. Do we think that that's a reasonable direction that society would ever take? Or is this like
Yes, it was the reasonable direction for nearly all of modern history.
was, but history moves in one direction, right?
Why?
Because of time?
I mean, people don't think that's in what way is that?
And I don't think we've ever
mean,
like
yes,
regressed
time-
social standards back to like, oh well, let's go 100 years back and do things that used to exist before. I
It's
think
weird.
things
The
like
entire left right now is arguing that we regress social standards by rejecting Roe versus Wade. So that's obviously not true.
the Roe versus Wade is not a social standard; it's a Supreme Court ruling. Number
Yes,
one.
but
Number
then-
two, what if you read the actual majority opinion on Roe v. Wade? We can see that socially we actually never made huge progress on how society viewed abortion. This has always been an incredibly divisive thing, right? Even that was, I think, part of Alito's writing on it was that things like gay marriage, for instance, we've kind of moved past and it's not really as debated anymore. But abortion was never a settled topic,
The
despite
notion,
Roe v. Wade.
the
despite
notion that the
Casey.
arc of history
Mhm.
constantly moves in one direction is belied by nearly all of the 20th century.
What do we mean by that?
I mean,
In
the
terms
first
of,
half
like,
of the
women's
20th
rights,
century is
civil
filled with
rights?
barbarism, communism, Nazism. All of that was a regression from what was happening at, for example, the beginning of the 19th century and the 20th century.
In what way?
Nazism and communism weren't a regression from what was
For,
going on
well,
in 1905.
these are in terms of like communism being a regression, for instance. I'm not a communist, but like the industrialization of the Soviet Union happened under a communist society. The
It's a
industrialization,
murder of tens of millions of people.
Yeah, there's
I consider
obviously
that a regression.
there.
A
Sure,
moral regression, which is what we are talking about now, moral regression. And you're
You're-
suggesting that moral regression, I wouldn't term
Mhm.
a return to traditional values a moral regression, you would. But your suggestion is that history only moves in one direction. And I'm suggesting that history does not only move in one direction, it tends to move actually back and forth.
sure. I don't think that all of history moves in one direction. There are going to be wars. There are going to be times of peace. I think in general we're more peaceful now than we have been in the past. But I think when we look at the way that people live
Okay, I see where Destiny's coming from in terms of his initial premise, in terms of how societal standards progress, very specific societal standards progress to a certain way. But in terms of other aspects of the world as a whole, we definitely go back and forth to regurgitating certain conflicts. Yeah, there's just a little disconnect right
their
between
lives,
the two
I
at
think
the
that we
moment.
tend to move in a certain direction socially. So when it comes to things like racism or when it comes to things like slavery or women's rights, I think that there are two huge things that probably aren't changing in the US, and one is access to contraception and one is women working jobs. I think that these two things are probably huge things that are moving us off of shotgun marriages or getting married very early on. And I don't see those. Do you think that those two things are going to change fundamentally?
First of all,
in
what the data tend to show is that actually more highly educated people, as you were saying, tend to get married more. So if the idea is that women getting an education somehow throws them off marriage, it's the opposite. Usually,
But those
it's
women
who
aren't
are not
getting.
educated.
But
who are
those
not
women aren't
getting married.
getting shotgun marriages. Those women aren't having children.
Yeah, but
when they're
now
18,
you're
17.
shifting the topic. My topic was how to get more people married. And what I'm and then you suggested that higher levels of education are delaying marriage and making it less probable. And what I'm telling you, because this is what the data suggests, is that actually as you raise up the educational ladder, people tend to be married more than they are lower down on the educational ladder. If you're a high school graduate, you're less likely to be married than if you're a postdoc.
I agree with you, but that's because one of the biggest precursors to getting married is having like a level of economic stability. So as people get more educated, they obtain this economic stability, and then they're in a more comfortable position to explore more serious.
Yeah, I
There's another
agree to
confound there. I mean, the confound is that
Mhm.
people in stable marriages tend to be the children of stable marriages. And there's only one way to break that cycle, which is to create a stable marriage. And that is something that is in everyone's hands. Again, this notion that it is somehow an unbreakable, unshatterable barrier to get married and have kids. I don't understand where this is coming from. Why is that such a challenge?
I don't
not a
think it's
challenge.
unbreakable or unshatterable. The initial point was for school, if we can provide a minimum level of educational stuff for children, that'd probably be good. But when we retreat back to, well, it has to be the families that are fixed first, fixing families is a multivariate problem that has so many
I am
different.
fine within my local community. We all vote. Again, I've suggested that there's a difference between local community and federal.
Mhm.
I'm fine with my local community voting for school lunches or air conditioning or whatever it is that we all agree to do, because the more local you get, the more homogeneity you get in terms of interest and the more interest you have in your neighbors. All that's fine. I'm part of a very, very solid community. In our community, we give to each other. We have minimum standards of helping one another. All that's wonderful. When it comes to the actual problem of education,
Mhm.
what I object to in the political sphere, and this happens all the time, is everybody is arguing on top of the iceberg about how we can move the needle 0.5 percentage points, as opposed to
Okay.
the entire iceberg melting beneath them. And we just ignore that. And we pretend that that's just, sort of the natural consequence of thing. The arc of history suggests that people are never going to get married again. Well, I mean, actually, what the arc of history suggests, realistically speaking, is that the people who are not getting married are not going to be having kids. And what it also suggests, the people who are married are going to be having kids. And so the demographic profile, actually, over time, is rather going to shift toward people who are having lots and lots of kids. I'm married. I have 4 kids. Everyone in my community is married. That's like minimum buy-in in my community is 4 kids. Okay, and so what's happening actually in terms of demographics is that the people who are more religious and getting married are having more kids. And so if you're talking about the arc of history shifting toward marriage, I would suggest that actually demographically over time, long periods of time, not over one generation, over long periods of time, the only cure for low birth rate is going to be the people who get married and have lots of kids.
I
Yeah,
agree
I
to
don't
that.
necessarily disagree with any of that, but I'm just saying that again on the. I know you're upset when I bring up the term merry-go-round. I think that there are good conversations to be had about people getting married because stable families produce stable children that are less likely to commit crime, that are more likely to go to school, that are more likely to be productive members of society, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that. All of that is true. It's just frustrating that sometimes when you bring up any problem, all of it will circle back to other things that makes it seem like we can't make any progress in any area without like fixing
In what
something.
way? I mean, I literally just told you that on the local level, I'm fine for people voting for air
Yeah, but so
conditioning.
for instance, on the local level, so for school funding is done, I think, generally per district. So what do you do when you have poor districts that can't afford air conditioner for their schools?
I mean, the idea there would be that presumably if the society, meaning the
This I'm very interested on Ben Shapiro's answer to this question because a lot of the things that Ben Shapiro said, I actually agree with. I think marriage is the most important thing for a family, is the most important thing for society, and obviously having kids is the most important thing for society. Marriage, having kids, fruitful family, all that is very, very, very important. But let's focus on the areas that are not able to do these things. Ben Shapiro, you do live in a very privileged, nice area, and you have a good amount of money. Let's talk about the places that don't have that money, that don't have those resources. Okay, do we just leave them to rot? Let me hear him.
state,
Mhm.
and I generally don't mean the federal state. I mean,
Sure.
like the state of California, for
Mhm.
example, decides that everybody ought to have air conditioning. People will vote for air conditioning, and that's perfectly legal. And I don't think there's anything morally objectionable about that per se.
Cool.
I also don't think that that's going to heal anything remotely like the central problem.
Sure,
And I
I
think that
agree.
what tends to happen in terms of government is people love arguing about the problems that can be solved by opening a wallet, and nobody likes to solve a problem by, you know, closing their sex life to one person, for example, or having kids within a stable religious community. Like the things that actually build society. Uh, I'm fine with arguing about each of these policies, and whether we apply them or not is a matter generally of pragmatism, not morality. It's a matter of incentive structures, not per se morality, because incentive structures do have moral underpinnings. There's such a thing as, for example, if you're going to use a welfare program, you have to decide how effective it is, to what crowd it applies, where the cutoffs are. Does it disincentivize work? Does it not?
Yeah.
All of these are
I agree.
pragmatic concerns. But on a moral level, the generalized objection that I have to people on the left side of the aisle is that they like to focus in these conversations. Very often, it feels as though it's conversation with people who are drunk searching under the lamp for their keys. The problems they want to look at are the problems that are solvable by government. And then all the problems they don't want to look at, which are the actual giant monsters lurking in the dark and not particularly solvable by government, are the ones they want to ignore and assume are just the natural state of things. And I don't think
Yeah.
that's correct at all.
And I 1,000,000,000% agree. But then obviously my criticism for
The problem here is that Shapiro and Destiny are so comfortable with dealing with the types of people that they're talking about, which I'm there with you. But my podcast allows me to talk with very open-minded people. But Shapiro's used to talking to people that don't care about the family structure, and always focus on the government enacting these new policies, which is fair. Destiny's familiar with talking with conservatives that don't care about the the specific programs that he's referring to, but also refers back to, oh yeah, the people are just corrupt. I see they're just familiar with conversing with specific types of people, so that they've eventually in this conversation they should be able to mend, realizing the type of person that they're talking to, and have a more productive conversation.
conservative side is the exact opposite, where there are parts where government could remedy some issues. For instance, children having sex with each other and producing other children out of wedlock. Like sometimes having after-school programs is nice to prevent that. Like I didn't have time for these things when I was in school. I was doing football practice. I was doing cross-country practice. I went in early for a band. I agree with you that sometimes people only focus on one end of the problem. I hate to be that guy, but as somebody that have you ever watched The Wire? Sure. I'm not going to cite The Wire as your life example, but like obviously there's only so much you can do in a school when the children coming in are so beyond destroyed because of the family life and everything prior to them even getting to school that day. So I agree. Government is not like the solution to broken families. That would never be the case.
And it's actually not the solution to education depending on the kind of solutions that you're talking about. Some solutions, yes. Some solutions, no.
Yeah.
So
the only thing I'm looking at is, as I said earlier, just like these minimum threshold things where it's like, where can government make? Because you mentioned marginal, which I think is a really good way to look at things. There's marginal cost and marginal utility to things, where the first $1,000 per student you spend might give you a huge return, but the extra 20,000 after. Is
yeah,
just
I
a
think these
waste
are all
of money.
pragmatic discussions.
Sure, of
and
course. Okay.
actually, this is what we used to hash out in legislatures before they turned into platforms for people grandstanding. But yes.
Sure. Okay. Yeah.
As we descend from the heavens
A
of
really good
philosophical discussion of
conversation.
conservatism and liberalism, let's go to the
I'd
pragmatic
be
muck
interested
of
on those.
politics.
Yeah, I think
Trump
you're about to
versus
get to
Biden.
it.
Between the two of them, who was in their first term the better president? And thus,
I'm
who
interested.
should win if the two of them are, in fact, our choices, should win a second term in 2024? Ben?
Sure. So, in terms of actual job performance, you have to separate it into a few categories. In terms of actual performance in foreign policy, I think Trump's foreign policy record is significantly better than Biden's. The world being on fire right now being a fairly good example of that. And we can
I'll
get
be
into
interested
each
on those
aspect of the world being on
policies.
fire and where the incentive structures came from and how all of that happened in a moment. When it comes to the economy, I think that Trump's economic record was better than Biden's. Doesn't mean he didn't overspend. He did. He wildly overspent. But he also had a very solid record of job creation. A huge percentage of the gains in the economy went to people on the lower end of the economic spectrum. Actually, the gross income to the average American was about $6,000 during his term. The unemployment rates were very, very low before COVID. I think that you almost have to separate the Trump administration into sort of before COVID and during COVID, because COVID
That's a little
obviously is sort of a
unfair.
black swan event, the most signal change in politics in our lifetime.
That's a little unfair, and I think Des is going to bring this up. The fact that Biden had to deal with COVID and the ramifications of COVID, that should kind of enlighten you. The fact that Shapiro was willing to separate Trump's presidency, that should give you a green light on maybe Biden's run wasn't as good as it could have been, considering the circumstance he was in. I'm just saying.
And so, governance during COVID is almost its own category, which we can discuss. But in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy, I think that Trump was significantly better than Biden has been, and that's on the upside for Trump. On the downside for Biden, obviously, you're talking 40-year highs in inflation. You're talking about savings being eaten away. You're talking about everything being 20 to 30% more expensive. You're talking about massive increases to the deficit, even at a rate that was unknown under Trump. The deficit under Trump raised by about a little under $1 trillion every year up until 2020. Again, 2020 was COVID year, so everybody decided that we're going to fire hose money at things. But then Joe Biden continued to fire hose money at things in 21, 22, and 23. That obviously is, in my opinion, bad economic policy. And then you get to the rhetoric, and you get to the stuff that Donald Trump says. And as I've said before, my view is that on Donald Trump's epitaph, on his gravestone, it will say Donald Trump. He said a lot of shit. I think that Donald Trump does say a lot of things. I think that that is basically baked into the cake, which is why everyone who's bewildered by the polls is ignoring human nature, which is at the beginning, when you see something very shocking, it's very shocking. And then if you see it over and over and over and over for years on end, it is no longer shocking. It's just part of the background noise, like tinnitus. It just becomes something that your brain adjusts for. And so do I like a lot of Donald Trump's rhetoric? No, and I never have. Do I think that that is dispositive as to his presidency? No, I do not. When it comes to Biden, again, I think he's underperforming economically. I think his foreign policy has been really a problem. Even the things I think he's done right are, I think, band-aids for things that he created by doing wrong. And when it comes to his own rhetoric, you can argue that it's grading on a curve, because
I'll
Trump
say
was
this: I'm
coming in
not a
with such
fan of
wild
Trump, but
rhetoric
I'm
that
here.
just to
I'm
maintain
curious
that
to
wild
what
rhetoric doesn't really
what
change
Destiny will
baseline.
say about this as
For
well.
Biden, he came in the same way that Obama did, on this sort of soaring rhetoric of American unity. I'm the president for all. Like Trump came in, he's like, listen, I'm the president for what I am, and I'm going to say the things I want to say. I'm on the toilet, I'm tweeting. We're like, okay, so that's what it is. With Biden, he came in with, I'm the president for all Americans. I'm trying to unify everybody, and that pretty quickly broke down into a lot of oppositional language about his political opponents in particular, an attempt to lump in, for example, huge swaths of the conservative movement with the people who participated, for example, in January 6th, or who were fans of January 6th. The sort of lumping in of everybody into MAGA Republicans who wasn't personally signed on to an infrastructure bill with him. That sort of stuff, I think, has been truly terrible. I thought his Philadelphia speech was truly terrible. And again, I think that you do have the problem of he is no longer capable of, certainly rhetorically, unifying the country when every speech from him feels like watching Nick Walenda walk across a volcano on a tightrope. I mean, it really is like you're just sort of waiting for him to follow. I mean, it's sad to say. I mean, the other day he was speaking for what was, in effect, his campaign kickoff, and this is in Valley Forge. And I mean, Jill rushed up there, like as soon as he was done. Jill rushed up there, like she'd been shot out of a cannon to come and try and guide him away so he didn't become the Shane Gillis Roomba. And that's not really.
Yeah, Joe Biden.
Let's put it this way: it does not quiet the soul to watch Joe Biden rhetorically. Again, it's a different problem than Trump's problem, but that's my analysis.
This is one of the areas where we get into this. I don't understand if there's like brain breaking happening or what's going on. I don't know what world we can ever live in where we say that Trump is less divisive for the country than Biden. I think it is so patently obvious. Trump is so divisive. Like, not only does Trump make an enemy out of every person in the opposition party, he makes an enemy out of his own party and every single person around him. Like, we all watched him bully, Jeff Sessions. We all watched him bully his own party on Twitter. We all watched like all of these people walk away from him. Even recently, I think. His the Secretary of Defense Esper and John Kelly, the Chief of Staff, were saying, I think Trump is a threat to democracy. You've got all of his prior people that were around him, some of his closest allies. You've got Bill Barr that won't co-sign a single thing that he says. You've got all these people that he used to work with that all say Trump is a horrible, evil person. He is ineffective as a leader. He doesn't accomplish anything, and he didn't. To say that Biden has failed at bipartisanship when we've gotten the CHIPS Act, we've gotten the IRA, we've gotten the ARP, we've gotten the bipartisan infrastructure bill, when we've got like all this major legislation that is working in this historically divided Congress, as opposed to Trump that got us tax cuts and deficit spending. I don't understand where we ever are in this world where Biden is somehow more divisive than Trump. Even the speeches
Yeah.
that Ben is bringing up, they always bring up. I remember that one. I think we might have even done it on our episode. The one speech that Biden gave, where at one point that like the background is red, and
That's the Philly speech I referenced.
Yeah, and they're like, "Oh my God, it's over. This is the end." And then meanwhile, you got Donald Trump, coming into office saying things like, "If you burn the flag, you should have your citizenship revoked," or talking about DNC, that I'm going to investigate every single one of these media organizations for corruptness. I'm going to open the libel and defamation laws. I'm going to take all of these guys to court.
Bro, all
He's got this
Donald
weird
Trump
Project
does is
2025
complain about
where,
stuff that he doesn't like, bro.
is it
I
John
swear to
Cashel, I
God.
think, is talking about, we're gonna investigate all of these people, and we're gonna try to throw crimes at all these people. Trump is like the most divisive president I think we've ever had in at least in my lifetime of being an American citizen. And the rhetoric from him is just, it's on a whole other level in terms of the demonization of political opponents. I mean, this is a guy that's known for giving his political opponents bad nicknames, right? Like, that's what Trump does. It's funny, but even as a resident of Florida, if Florida had another natural disaster, do you think Trump would withhold aid? Because you had, I think that was one of the few nice things that DeSantis actually said about Biden, was like, hey, listen, when the buildings collapsed in, I think that was in Miami Beach, yeah, that, for the hurricane stuff, that Biden was there. He was saying, if you guys need aid, however many billions, you can have it. Meanwhile, Trump, I think, was threatening to withhold federal funding from blue states that wouldn't, I think it had to do with the National Guard stuff, the deployment of the National Guard, that they weren't like doing enough for the riots. And Trump was threatening to withhold aid from some of these blue states. Yeah, Trump is literally the most divisive person in the world. I don't see how on any metric he is ever succeeding in the divisive category. In terms of the economy, I do think it's funny that Republicans are very keen to say that, like, well, we can't really grade Trump, post-COVID, because obviously COVID.
Yeah, that's
which is
exactly what
fair,
I said.
But pre-COVID, what did Trump do? Yeah, he did deficit spending, tax cuts. He presided over historic low interest rates and an economy that was already like blazing past the final years of Obama. We were posting all-time highs on all the stock markets in 2013 onwards. Unemployment rates were falling. Now under Biden, unemployment rates are even lower than they were under Trump. But it sucks that for Trump, we can say, well, we can't really hold him accountable for 2020. That was COVID. Well, all we have for Biden is post-COVID. We don't have any pre-COVID Biden, economy. And it was the same thing for Obama too, coming in right after the housing collapse as well. And it sucks that Republicans are able to walk out of office, having burned the entire American society to the ground economically, and now we've got to try to evaluate, okay, well, what did Obama do during his first 2 to 3 to 4 years, just trying to recover from where the housing crash left it? And then we look at Biden now, who's trying to recover from COVID, and now we're grading him on a totally different scale than what Trump is being graded on. Yeah, that sucks, I think.
Exactly what I said.
Foreign policy.
On the foreign policy, I'm going to be honest. I am very liberal. I'm very not progressive. I'll probably come off as more hawkish than others because I'm not a big fan of this. Which also, if Ben agrees, like, I think people like Trump are going to be the most dovish isolationist people ever. They don't want to do anything, internationally. They just want to protect America.
That's the biggest thing when it comes to the foreign policy. It really depends on what you think the role of America should be. And I think the role America should focus on our people first, but America should also focus on our responsibility as the most powerful nation in the world, the leader of the United Nations, and we have allies across the world and we have enemies across the world. So it's ignorant to think that we can be isolationist at any point. And this is just a situation where Biden has to get involved because, one, our ally is getting messed with in Israel, and two, we don't want Russia to gain unnecessary power influence in China as well. So it's a weird situation, but it'll be a terrible idea if America just let it be.
Be at home, protect our economy, don't do anything internationally, which is why he was constantly undermining NATO and constantly, attacking all of the European Union and, cheering on the UK for Brexiting away from the EU. I think that being said, I think that Biden's done a phenomenal job when it comes to foreign policy. I think that the coalition building was so important for Ukraine, Russia, and I'm so happy that he decided to go to our European allies and our NATO allies and try to build a coalition of people to help Ukraine, so that that wasn't only the United States. Personally, especially after doing a whole bunch of research, I do tend to side with Israel over Palestine in a lot of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. I'm glad that Biden, while remaining a staunch defender,
Yeah, I'm interested because Ben Shapiro should actually be praising Biden because he's pro-Israel. So I'm curious to see what Ben Shapiro has to say over Biden and how he handled Israel and Palestine. I'm
Israel
curious.
is trying to rein in some of the more aggressive posturing towards the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. I'm proud that Biden said, hey, listen, we're going to delay some of these attacks. Hey, listen, we are going to allow humanitarian aid here. Hey, listen, we are going to try to, not kill as many Palestinian people down there, while still, signaling that he would be a staunch supporter of Israel in the conflict, assuming the civilian casualties don't go too high. For foreign policy, I mean, blemishes. I mean, like the biggest one you can give to Biden is Afghanistan and the pull out there. But man, are we going to talk about, the Inspector General report that says that one of the biggest reasons why the Afghanistan pullout was so disastrous was because of the Doha Accords, where Donald Trump headed talks that didn't even include the Afghanistan army? I mean, like these were disasters. Like when Biden took office, we had 2,500 troops left in Afghanistan. Like what was the options even afforded to Biden at that point? Obviously, you've got the abandonment of the
But he
Kurds
did
in
bring him
Syria
out.
to, for the Turkish armies to lay waste to. I can talk about Iran and North Korea, although I'm not sure where Ben would land on those. But yeah, that's a broadly. Yeah.
That's a lot from both.
There's a lot,
You
yeah.
want to pick at something where you disagree with here?
Well, I mean, there's a lot. So, I mean, so I want to ask a few questions on each one of these.
Yeah, sure.
So let's talk about divisiveness for a second. So there's no one who can make the case that Donald Trump is not divisive.
Yeah.
Of course, he's incredibly divisive. It's a given. Do you treat Biden's rhetoric with the same level of seriousness that you treat Trump's rhetoric? Or I should probably put that the other way around. Should we treat Trump's rhetoric with the same level of seriousness as Joe Biden or, say, Barack Obama's rhetoric?
I'm going to try to be concise in answers. Broadly speaking, especially in studying Israel, Palestine, and Ukraine, Russia, I try not to take politicians at their word because sometimes they just say stuff to say stuff. I understand that. But broadly speaking, I'm going to look at the rhetoric and the actions, and I am going to grade them the same. So yes, I would hold Biden and Trump to the same standard.
Right. So my feeling is, and this is one area where, for clarification, we're going to have a division, is that I, of course, don't treat Trump's rhetoric in the same way that I treat Biden's or Obama's. He's utterly uncalibrated, and he says whatever he wants to at any given time, and it doesn't even match up with his policy very often.
Can I ask you, like, for our head of state, our chief executive, shouldn't rhetoric be arguably one of the most important things that he does?
I mean, the answer would be yes. And now I've been given a choice between a person who I think in calibrated ways says things that are divisive and a person who in uncalibrated ways says things that are divisive. And so the evidence that Joe Biden is divisive is every poll taken since essentially August of 2021. He is, by all available metrics, incredibly divisive. A huge percentage of Americans are deeply unhappy, not only with his performance, but don't believe he's a uniter. That's just the reality. And that may just be a reflection. I mean, honestly, we may be putting too much on Trump or Biden personally. It may just be that the American people themselves are rhetorically divided because of social media.
Which I
and
think is
social
more the
media
case. And I
and
do
fact
think it's
accessible
more of a
and all
The
of
thing
that.
that I would ask
effect
you about
of
that, though,
Trump.
is I agree, especially when you look at the
Of
favorability.
what Trump
but
has done.
sometimes when I look at these polls, when you start to disaggregate them by party, I wonder if it's actually, is Biden historically divisive? Or I'm trying to think of a really polite way to say this. The people that like Trump worship Trump. I don't know. Like one of the most prescient things that Trump could have probably ever said was that I could kill someone on Fifth Street and nobody would hold me accountable. So is it really that Biden is historically divisive, or is it that every single Trump supporter will always say that Trump is great and
No,
always say that Biden is
the
bad?
reason I would say
That's
Biden
what I
is
think it
historically
is,
divisive
personally.
because Republicans felt much more strongly about Barack Obama
I agree.
than Joe Biden, actually.
But they didn't feel as strongly about Trump as they did about like Romney or McCain, right?
In what way? I mean,
And
like,
the allegiance to Trump.
oh no, there's certainly more allegiance to Trump than there is to Romney or McCain, largely because Trump won in 2016. But beyond that, the point that I'm making is that if you're looking at the stats in terms of divisiveness, Republicans always find the Democratic president divisive. The question is where the rest of the country is. And right now, there are a lot of Democrats who either don't agree with Biden or find him divisive. There are a lot of independents who find him divisive. So when we're comparing these things, I don't think they're leagues apart in terms of the divisive effect of what they say. Right, and I'm separating that off from like the inherent content of what they say. Because obviously, what Trump says is more divisive just on like the raw level. I mean, if he's insulting people as opposed to Joe Biden doing MAGA Republicans, like if I were an alien come down from space and look at these two statements, I'd say this one's more divisive than this one. But then there's the reality of being a human being in the world, and that is everyone has baked Donald Trump into the cake. And Joe Biden again started off with a patina of being non-divisive, and now has emerged as divisive.
I see what Shapiro's saying.
Questions, because this one is actually slightly less interesting to me.
Sure.
Yeah,
Well, can
you're
I
free to answer. Sure, go for
just
it.
one quick thing, I guess, like, because we could say the reality of it and we can look at opinion polls. What if we look at like legislative accomplishments? Like Biden is working on a 50-50 divided Senate. Donald Trump had both houses of Congress and the Supreme Court and got like no major legislation passed.
Well, I mean, he did lose Congress in 2018. But
Sure, but prior to that, because we got the infrastructure bill, I think, in 1 year, which Trump promised for his entire presidency, didn't get anywhere on
well,
it.
I mean, yes, his Republican base was not in favor of mass spending on infrastructure, and neither am I. So there's that. I think that's
Sure,
mostly a state and local
but they were
issue.
in favor of mass spending for tax cuts.
That's not spending. I mean,
Effectively it is, right? Like,
effectively, it's not.
well, if you're cutting tax receipts, but you're not changing the level of spending, like Biden did with the IRA.
I mean, again, we have a fundamental philosophical difference here. I think that when the government takes my money, that is not the government somehow being more fiscally responsible. And when the government allows me to keep my money, I don't see that as the government spending. I see that as my money, and the government is taking less of it.
That's great, but at the end of the day, the government is still going to be in a deficit spending, and they're going to have to borrow money from the treasury.
Right, we have a spending problem. In other words, not a receipts problem is the case that I'm making. The problem with Donald Trump is not that he lowered taxes. The United States has one of the most progressive tax systems on the planet. And in fact, if you wish to have a European-style social welfare state, what you actually need is to tax the middle class to death. I mean, the reality is the top 20% of the American population pays literally all net taxes in the United States after state benefits and all of this.
Sure.
So if you actually wanted to have the kind of social welfare state that many liberals seem to want to have, like Northern Europe, for example, you'd actually have to tax people who make $40,000, $50,000, $60,000.
And I don't want that. I agree with that. So
So-
how do you explain the lack of legislation?
I mean,
If he's like such a uniter.
because I think the Republican Party itself is quite divided, and I think that Trump's.
But isn't that his
can-
job? He's the head of the Republican Party. He's the Republican president of the United States.
I mean, again, I don't think that Joe Biden has passed wildly historic legislation.
the
other
infrastructure
than,
bill was the largest, like.
so here's the problem. If you're a Republican,
Uh-huh.
the only bills that you can get consensus on tend to be bills that either that let's be real about this, that are tax cuts, because as you would, I think, agree with, when it comes to polling data, Americans constantly say they want to cut the government, and then the minute you ask them which program, they have
They
no
don't
idea
want
what
to
they're
cut
right, exactly. And so it's much harder to come up with a bill to cut things than it is to come up with a bill to add things. Which is why.
These are fair statements, but that's the problem with the Republican Party, right? That's the Republican Party's fault in terms of the things they do and don't want to do. What you're making it sound like, Shapiro, is that the Republican Party is less effective than the Democratic Party. That's what it sounds like.
Why spending was out of control under Trump as well. But there's some Republicans who still don't want to spend on those things, right? So inherently, the task that this goes back to the first question. The task that Republicans think government is there to do is different than the task that Democrats think that government is there to do. So the way that the very metric of success for a Democratic president versus a Republican president, namely, for example, pieces of legislation passed, as a Republican, one of my goals is to pass nearly no legislation because I don't actually want the government involved in more areas of our life. I want to ask a couple questions on the foreign policy.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Wait. Real quick. So, for instance, like Donald Trump wanted to punish China, and he wanted to bring microprocessor manufacturing to the United States. Biden did that with legislation, with the CHIPS Act. You talk about like spending being out of control, and I mean, I can agree with that. I think anybody that looks at the numbers has to agree with that. But why not pass legislation like the Inflation Reduction Act, which is at least like spending neutral, right? Like, why are there not bills where Donald Trump could take?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that whenever the government says something is spending neutral, it rarely materializes that way. That is not going to be a spending neutral bill.
Sure, but there's a difference
Inflation
between like at least they say it's spending neutral versus this is a $500 billion bill over like 10 years.
I mean,
right?
but again, I don't see a tax cut as a matter of quote spending neutrality. The big problem is they keep spending, not that they are allowing me to keep the money that I earned and they did not earn. But
okay, so then just to understand, so if somebody just did massive like reductions in tax receipts, so tax cut after tax cut after tax cut, but they didn't change spending at all, you wouldn't consider that like an increase in deficit spending or out of control spending. You would just say they're just tax cuts.
No, the opposite. I would consider it a wild. I would consider it a wild overspending.
Okay.
Meaning
so then
that,
was it under Trump then when he did the tax?
I mean, the deficit spending,
2017?
by the way, under Biden is way worse than it was under.
Of course, but we're in post-COVID, right?
Sorry, I'm looking at this. Ooh, Travis Kelce on smoke. I like to see it, but it's already making the
COVID
making
ended
the
effectively. We
great
live in Florida.
chiefs
COVID
look like the
effectively ended in the
villains.
state of Florida by the middle of 2021.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
even
why,
if you're a
like,
vaccine fan, by like April, May of 2021, there was wide availability of vaccines, whether or not you like the vaccines.
Yeah.
And at that point, we were done.
I agree,
mean,
but like we're in a post, like how many trillions of dollars have been dumped in worldwide that are like leading to inflation, right? The inflation is like a worldwide issue right now because of the economy shutting down for a year or two. It's not like those effects are gone in 1 year, right? COVID might be gone, but the after effects of all the stimulus spending and the unemployment and
the
everything else.
definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So pouring more money on top of that makes for more inflation. That's what it does.
Sure, I agree. But like there's also the definition of when do you deficit spend is when economies are headed for recessions, right? Rather than when economies are doing really well, like they were under Trump and he was deficit spending, whereas Biden can at least make the argument that I ought to be deficit spending because the economy is heading for potential recession. Right?
So here's the thing. I don't think that the economy was actually headed for recession. In fact, if you look at the economic
Every
statistics,
economist said it was.
No,
Every economist. They're still saying that there's like a recession coming, right?
Right, but that was largely because of the after effects of inflation. Meaning, if you inflate the economy, what you're going to end up doing is bursting a bubble, and then when that bubble bursts, you'll get a recession. I mean, that was the basic idea, right? The question was whether you're going to get a soft landing. But if you actually look at, for example, the employment statistics or the economic growth statistics in the United States, what they look like under the last year's Obama and then Trump. I mean, this is what the chart looks like. Is it looks like this, and then it hits March of 2020, it goes like that.
Yeah.
Right, and then by like September, it bounces back up. Right, it's a V-shaped recovery, and then it starts to peter out.
Sure.
And
A lot
then
because of the American Recovery Plan, right? That Biden did as well.
I mean,
4 million jobs. Yeah.
no, I'm not going to attribute it to that because the rates of growth in job growth from September, October, November were actually very similar to the rates of job growth after Joe Biden took office. What you see is actually kind of a straight line. I mean, what the chart looks like. In any case, okay. So
Yeah, sorry,
on the foreign
let's
policy stuff, this is getting abstruse, but on the foreign policy stuff, so the questions
That was an
I have
interesting
with regard to
conversation,
Biden
I'm
on
gonna be
foreign
honest.
policy, very very simple question.
Mhm.
Do you think that the situation in the Middle East is better now than it was under Donald Trump?
Probably. That's a hard one. The factors
Why?
that I'm making right now are like obviously you've got the Israel-Palestinian war that's going on right now, which is kind of bad. But like broadly speaking, I'm not sure how much that affects the Middle East as much as like the collapse of Syria. 2013 Syrian civil war sent millions of immigrants throughout all of Europe, and
Which was under
which was under Obama and continued
Right.
under Trump. Trump didn't do anything to alleviate any of the Syrian civil war. In
why did Syria end up as a preserve of Russia again?
how did Syria end up as a preserve of Russia?
Yes, why did it end up being essentially a client state of Russia?
I know that Putin enjoys access to the ports down there. I don't know.
I mean, the reason is because Barack Obama suggested that there was a red line that would be drawn in the face of chemical weapons use. Bashar al-Assad then used chemical weapons in Syria, and Barack Obama was unwilling to then essentially create consequences for Syria in the form of any sort of Western strike, and so instead he outsourced it to Russia. This is 2013, 2014.
Sure.
Right,
Do you think there might have been some hesitancy after like seeing how Libya ended up that maybe us like intervening?
Who was president during Libya? Yeah, I mean, like, so
Sure, but what does that have to do with anything? I'm just
I mean,
saying that, like, there might have been like a mistake
the
learned.
point that I'm making
like,
is that actually the Middle East, I mean, just historically speaking, was historically good under Donald Trump. I mean, it's very difficult to make a case that either before or after Trump were better than during Donald Trump.
was
Like,
it
this
good?
is
I
an
mean,
area of-
the
yes.
Syrian. I don't think that Trump contributed to the Syrian situation in improving much. I
Well, I
think
mean, he
he caught
did
a
wreck
lot
ISIS.
of.
He did wreck ISIS, which was in the.
I mean,
was
ISIS had been getting wrecked by the Kurds in Iraq, by every single person, by Assad's
there's a
army,
lot-
by Putin, by Turkey. Literally everybody was fighting against ISIS at that point.
There's a spike in violence, and then the
Mhm.
the Trump. I mean, you get credit for when you're president, presumably. I mean, things got better with ISIS under Trump.
I mean, yeah, they did. I mean,
Things got worse
were-
with ISIS under Obama.
for sure.
He called them the
considering
JV
that-
squad,
Sure.
and then they became not the JV squad.
Yeah, but
and
I
then
don't know
they
if
ended
ISIS
under
is
Trump.
originating in Syria and Baghdadi and all of the growth of that is necessarily Obama's fault. I know that we like to say that Obama created ISIS. I don't know if you say that, but I've heard that saying a lot. I think that's a little bit simplistic. I don't think that when I'm looking at like actions that presidents have taken, the biggest criticism I have for like Middle Eastern policy is I think the Doha Accords were a disaster, and I think that's like one of the biggest blemishes that we have right now. I would also argue that moving the embassy to Jerusalem was also kind of silly and arguably contributed to some of the conflict we see right now.
No,
between
it's
Israel
actually,
and
I'll
Palestine.
argue precisely the opposite,
Go ahead.
especially given the fact that after the movement of the embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords continued to sign and actually expand. And that if Donald Trump had been elected, I have no doubt in my mind that Saudi Arabia would now be a part of the Abraham Accords. In fact, that was basically pre-negotiated. And then when Joe Biden took office, Joe Biden took a very anti-Saudi stance on a wide variety of issues. The biggest single effect in the Middle East of Joe Biden's presidency, and again, I agree with you that not every foreign policy issue can be laid at the hands of a president. Joe Biden's main approach to the Middle East was very similar to the Obama approach, which is why the Middle East was chaotic under Obama and chaotic under Biden. And that was to alienate allies like Saudi Arabia and Israel, and instead to try to make common cause or cut deals with Iran. What that did is incentivize terrorism from Iran. What we're watching in the Middle East is Iran attempting to use every one of its terror proxies in the Middle East, and it was specifically launched in an attempt to avoid what Biden actually was trying to do, which was good, which was after 2 years of failure with Saudi Arabia, try to bring them into the Abraham Accords, right? That was what was burgeoning at the end of last year. And Iran saw that, and Iran decided that they were going to throw a grenade into the middle of those negotiations by essentially activating Hamas. Hamas commits October 7th. Israel, as a sovereign nation state, has to respond to the murder of 1,200 of its citizens and the taking kidnapping of 240. Israel has to do that not only to go after its own hostages and try to restore them, but also to reestablish military deterrence in the most violent region of the world.
Interesting.
Hezbollah gets active on Israel's northern border. Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy. They get active on the northern border. The Houthis in Yemen get active. These are all the only reason all this is happening at the same time is because Iran is doing this, right? And not just that, they're threatening global shipping.
Sure.
If you're talking about the effects of global supply lines, which I totally agree, had a major
Interesting. Okay, this is some new information that I didn't realize. Obviously, I knew that Iran is a heavy factor in a lot of the stuff that is taking place, but the actual details on terms of Iran's impact, I'm sure this is, you could argue, speculation, but this is interesting information nonetheless.
inflationary effect on the economy thanks to COVID. Right now, the cost of shipping is nearly double what it was just a few weeks ago, and that is because a ragtag group of Houthi barbarians are attacking international shipping and forcing everybody to stop using the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and instead going around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. All of that is the result of the fact that Joe Biden reoriented the United States in the very early days in favor of a more pro-Iranian stance. He appointed Robert Malley to negotiate the Iran deal, who, as it turns out, was using proxies. Many of his aides were actually taking money from Iran. The Biden administration, literally one of their first acts was to delist the Houthis as a terror organization and end sanctions against the Houthis. These are all moves that Biden made very early on. They were disastrous moves. But when it comes to domestic policy, I think he hasn't been nearly as damaging
Wait,
on
let's
domestic
hold it.
policy
Let's
as he has
do
been on foreign
sure,
policy.
sure. So just on a couple of Middle Eastern things. So one of the big things that threw the Middle East into disaster was we are all traumatized by it now. Was the Iraq invasion, which happened under a Republican president.
Sure.
We agree with that, right?
Sure.
Yes. The deposition of Saddam Hussein and everything that followed after probably contributed more to the growth of ISIS and the destabilization of that entire region, probably more than anything else. I think that prior to Bush, for Clinton, and even at the beginning of Bush's presidency, we were on some kind of road to normalcy with Iran, which I think has to happen, whether we like them or not, until Bush, for whatever reason, decides to throw Iran into the axis of evil.
I
And
need some
we
evidence
decide-
that we were on a road to normalcy with Iran in the 1990s.
we do in the wait what?
That we were on a road to normalcy with Iran in the 1990s.
My understanding is that, yeah, from the late 90s and prior to the axis of evil labeling of Iran, that there was going to be some path forward to where we could start to normalize relationships with them.
I find that very difficult to believe, and I don't see a lot of evidence. I mean, we can just disagree on that.
Sure,
but,
okay,
but
yeah, sure,
the-
we can disagree on that, but I know that
the,
once
the,
they
by
got
the way,
thrown into it,
the after effects, just a quick note, the after effect of the Iraq War that was the most devastating was the increase in power of Iran.
I agree, yeah, because of the destabilization
Yes.
of Iraq, and Iraq not having a government there that was functional for at least a decade.
And was in fact a Sunni
Also
government, right?
allowed-
Originally, it was a Sunni government. Disbanding the Sunni army was one of the worst things that the Bush
Probably,
administration
yeah,
did.
banning all the former Ba'ath parties, all the
sectarian,
Congress,
yes.
yeah, all horrible under a Republican president. But
Don't disagree.
that that probably contributed more to ISIS, to the growth of power in Iran, maybe even to the destabilization of Syria, probably more than anything that Obama did. Also, when we look at Iran funding people in the region, I don't disagree with that as well. I think Iran is the #1 instigator of bad guy things right now in the Middle East. Iran, the IRGC, I supported when Donald Trump killed Soleimani. I think that was a great thing. I think that Iran is a major problem. However, I don't know if the path forward is constantly being a belligerent to Iran or trying to figure out some road to normalcy. I don't know if the collapse of Iran or the destruction of that country, considering how unpopular the Ayatollah even is there, like the citizens of Iran, I don't think are big supporters of the government there. I feel like moving on a path where, let's do our nuclear inspections. We had that Iranian nuclear deal that Trump pulled out of. Let's do the nuclear inspections. Make sure you're not on a way to nuclear weapons. Let's unfreeze some funds. Let's move in some direction where we get on a good term with you. I feel like that's the most important thing that needs to happen in the Middle East. As much as people like to look at the Abraham Accords, who cares if, what was it? Bahrain, I think Oman, I think
UAE,
Sudan,
Morocco.
the UAE and Morocco, yeah, or something like all of these people, even Saudi Arabia, already have like de facto normalization with Israel anyway. They're all trading.
No,
they're all
this is, I mean, to pretend that anybody even 15 years ago would have been talking about normalization in Saudi Arabia and Israel is insane.
They,
I mean, that's insane.
they were already on that path.
They
They had already been they were already de facto
that's a
trading
w-
partners with each other.
that
They had
that's
already been collaborating and
that's
doing
a
things.
wild claim that Israel and Saudi Arabia were going to normalize 15 years ago.
15
That-
years ago might have been a wild claim.
that's
but after Turkey, after Jordan, and then in the past like 20 years of like economic relations and ties with each other, all of the leadership in the Middle East, and you'll agree with this, look at Israel and they go, okay, well, we got Palestinians who, God bless them, do nothing, and then you've got Israel, which is on a region with no natural resources to somehow become like an economic giant. They're good to trade with. Their population is educated. They have military power. All of the leadership in these Middle Eastern countries are wanting to be friendly with Israel and are engaging in trade de facto with Israel. And the idea that like the UAE and Bahrain were brought in to say like, oh well, now we're going to officially say this. I just
those are the first steps toward obviously the formation of a new Middle East in which economics would predominate over sectarian conflict. The chief obstacle to that is Iran.
I agree.
The notion that negotiations with the Ayatollah were going to be a solution to any of this is
But do we think
absolutely benighted.
is it the Abraham Accords that's convincing Saudi Arabia to take a stance against Iran?
No, I mean,
No,
Saudi
but
Arabia.
they're already fighting. Yeah, they're already fighting with each other, right? Like, I don't think the Abraham Accords moved us any closer towards any type of real peace in the
No,
region.
the point
What has to happen is something has to happen with Iran. There has to be some diplomatic bilateral communication there.
No, what has to happen is the containment of Iran, which was what was taking place with the increased normalization with the Sunni Arab world and Israel, combined with significant economic sanctions. The notion that there's this far-fetched notion in foreign policy circles that diplomacy can sort of be wish cast out of thin air. That if you sit around a table, that you can always come to an agreement with somebody. The Ayatollahs do not have common interests with the United States. They do not. And this idea that they are willing to take money in exchange for example, some sort of peaceful acquiescence to Israel's existence is obviously untrue.
Hasn't that been the case though? That you've had a region with tons of sectarian violence for a long time, and then finally Turkey was like, you know what, this isn't worth it. The United States paid them a lot of money. They had conversations with Israel. You know what, the economic gains.
Well, I mean,
and same thing with Jordan, same thing with
not into Turkish politics,
Sure,
but the situation with Turkey was actually quite warm between Israel and Turkey in the 90s when you had the sort of
I'm just watching with you guys
secular
right now.
Muslim
This is
regime in
the
the 90s, but they
I don't do
Turkey
much
and
like
and now Erdogan
studying in
has
terms of
joined
like
in the fray.
foreign
Erdogan is
countries.
significantly more radical.
Sure.
than
I'm
I
so
focus
sorry.
more on like what's going
If I
on
said
in
Turkey,
America.
Egypt. My bad.
Yeah, okay, so
But
right,
these
so-
tensions
yeah,
are
so,
obviously
yeah, in terms
important
of
in terms
Egypt
of
and
how
Jordan,
the
like,
United
refer
States
to-
got
you need-
involved
so
in terms of the
here's
conflict
thing.
between
Is it
Israel and
possible that you
Palestine.
could theoretically come to a deal with Iran only with a new leadership group? Okay, this is true for every peace agreement in the region.
Mhm.
You could not. Israel could not have made peace with.
Well, they made peace with
For-
Egypt, and,
no, no,
and Sadat was the leader for Yom Kippur,
They
right?
did not make peace with Nasser. Right.
Sure.
The point is that this is a different regime. You need a different regime. This is
But I'm
one of
saying
the
the same regime that did the part of the Yom Kippur War was the same regime that negotiated peace with Israel.
I mean, that's true.
Mhm.
It is also true that that is a relationship that could be cultivated specifically because
I'm going to have to
It was
skip
set up to
past
be-
this because I got
But
something to
before we go
do.
Ukraine, can I ask about
But
Israel?
that was a really
Like,
good
you're both
conversation.
mostly in agreement But what is
Well, I don't know if I'd say that.
Okay, but as I'm learning, what is Israel doing right? What is Israel doing wrong in this very specific current war in Gaza?
I mean, frankly, I think that what Israel's doing wrong is if I were Israel, okay, like again, America's interests are not coincident with Israel's interests. If I were an Israeli leader, I would have swiveled up and out and knocked the bleep out of Hezbollah early.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
So I would have. Yoav Gallant, who's the defense minister of Israel, was encouraging Netanyahu, who's the prime minister, and the war cabinet, including Benny Gantz. So whenever people talk about the Netanyahu government, that's not what's in place right now. There's a unity war government in place that includes the political opposition. The reason I point that out is because there are a lot of people politically who will suggest that the actions Israel is currently taking are somehow the manifestation of a right-wing government. Israel currently does not have a quote-unquote right-wing government. They have a unity government that includes the opposition. In any case, Yoav Gallant was urging in the very early days of the war that Israel should turn north, and instead
Fair
of hitting
point.
Hamas, they should actually take the opportunity to knock Hezbollah out, because Hezbollah is significantly more dangerous to the existence of the state of Israel than Hamas. I actually agree with that. As far as what Israel has been doing wrong in the actual war, I mean, I think that, again, from an American perspective, I think that Israel is doing pretty well. From an Israeli perspective, if I were Israeli, I would actually want Israel to be less loose about sending its soldiers in on the ground level. So Israel's attempting to minimize civilian casualties, and the cost of that has been the highest military death toll that Israel has had since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. I mean, I personally know, through 1 degree of separation, 3 separate people have been killed in Gaza, and that's because they're going in door to door. It's because they're attempting to minimize civilian casualties, and they're losing a lot of guys in this particular war. The problem that Israel has had, historically speaking, is that Israel got very complacent about its own security situation. They believed the technology was going to somehow correct for the hatred on the other side of the wall. That so our people have to live underground for 2 weeks at a time while some rockets fall, but at least it's not a war. And that complacence, bred what happened on October 7th. So to me, what Israel did wrong was years and years and years of complacence and belief in an Oslo system that is at root a failure, because you cannot make a peace agreement with people who do not want to make peace with you. So that's what I think Israel is doing wrong. I have a feeling there's going to be wide divergence on this point.
Maybe. In terms of broadly speaking, I generally oppose settlement expansion. Is a thing that Israel does incorrectly that I think is kind of like provocative to at least all the Palestinians in the West Bank, and it probably energizes hatred in the Gaza Strip for them as well. In terms of conducting warfare, the one thing that I always say to everybody, especially Americans, is you can't evaluate things from an American perspective. It's very stupid. It happened a lot with Ukraine, where people are like, oh, well, didn't they work with the Nazis, and like weren't the Soviets the good
Yeah, that
guys?
was
Well,
actually
in
very,
other
very,
parts of the
very
world, it's
dumb.
not quite as simple. And I think the same is true for Israel-Palestine. That a lot of Americans will analyze the conflict as just being one between only Israel and Palestine, which it's not. It's a conflict between Israel and then Palestine, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran. Right now it is. I think that however, one area where I'll break with Ben is I think that minimizing civilian casualties and everything is very, very, very important. I think on the Israeli side, I don't think it's important so that the U.S. will stay with them, because I think the U.S. is probably going to stick with Israel as long as they don't do anything crazy. And I don't even think it matters for the international community. It definitely doesn't matter for the UN, because Jesus Christ. However, I think it's really, really, really important that I think that in the Middle East, broadly speaking, I think that leadership, especially in the Gulf, has gotten over the Palestinian issue. I think that leadership is kind of like they don't care as much anymore, but the populations still care quite a bit. And I think that the main issue that Israel could run into is if the civilian death toll does climb too high, and if they start to hit this 40, 50, 60,000 number of civilian casualties, they run the risk of the civilian populations in the surrounding Middle Eastern states becoming so antagonistic towards Israel that they start to take steps back towards normalization in the region. So for instance, I know that Bahrain, I think, already pulled out their ambassador to Israel. My guess is going to be it's temporary. I know that on the public speaking side, you've got a lot of people condemning
Yeah, I
Israel
know
for the
the
attacks. On the private side, you've got
international
people
courts
telling
are
Israel,
also
"Please
kind of
kill all
upset
of
with
Hamas
Israel
because
right
this is
now in terms
untenable
of the
and nobody
UN.
wants to work in this situation." I don't know if this ended up being true or not. I'm guessing it didn't. But I saw on a couple of Twitter accounts it was leaked that potentially Saudi Arabia was considering installing a government in the West Bank that they would run.
No, I mean, I think Israel would love nothing better than that, but that is
For
not
sure,
something that
yeah,
Saudi.
okay.
One of the big problems in the Middle East is literally no one wants to preside over the Palestinians.
Yes.
No one.
So
Maybe
I
the Arab
think that-
states, Israel, no one.
Yeah. So I think the issue is, and I'm largely actually, I'm very sympathetic towards the Palestinians, because I think that for since 48 and onwards, I think that all of the Arab states super gassed them up on that. They wanted the Palestinians to fight because they wanted to fight with Israel. However, as time has gone on and they realized that it's kind of a lost cause, states have started to drop out. So you're getting these bilateral peace treaties with Egypt and with Jordan. You're getting multilateral agreements like the Abraham Accords. And now the Palestinians are looking around and like, okay, well, you guys told us to fight all this time, and now the only people that we have supporting us are Iranian proxies. So the Palestinians are in a very weird spot where they've like lost all their support. I think that Israel, what I would say to be quote unquote critical of Israel is Israel needs to take strong steps towards peace that probably involves them enduring some undue hardship. So not the October 7th attacks, because Jesus, that's way too much. But other types of attacks that they might have to deal with that might cause some civilians to die that they don't come out over the top with and retaliate with if there's ever going to be peace in that region. However, another thing that I've always said is a huge problem between Israel and Palestine is I think that both sides think that if they continue to fight, it will be good for them. But the problem is one side is delusional. I think Israel wants to continue to fight because they get justifications for the annexation of the Golan Heights. They get justifications for expansions, especially in Area C, that I think they're probably going to try to annex soon. They get justifications for the increased military posturing towards the Gaza Strip and the embargoes. And Israel is right that if the conflict continues, really the situation only improves for Israel over time. But the Palestinians also all believe that if they keep fighting, they've thought this since 2000 under Arafat, that if they just keep fighting, they'll get better gains too. But that's not the case.
Is there a difference between Palestinian citizens and the leadership when you say that?
I love all people. I love all people around the world. And I think that when we analyze issues, I think that we have to be very honest with what the people on the ground think. And the idea that Hamas is just this one-off thing in the Gaza Strip is not only incorrect with the situation on the ground, it's also incredibly ahistorical. And the idea that like the Palestinians in the West Bank, of which I believe the most recent polling shows, I want to say 75 to 80% support the October 7th attacks. Palestinians in general want to fight in violent conflict with Israel. That's not.
Yeah, I think people need to realize this, that the civilians that are a part of the situation are very much a part of what is going on. Like, I think at this point it's kind of ignorant to go like, oh yeah, they're just like getting ruled over Hamas. Hamas is just like telling them what to do, held them captive. I feel like that's a bit too ignorant at this point to make that claim.
Just the position of the government. That's not just people. There's a reason why Abbas doesn't want to do elections in the West Bank, and it's because the Palestinian people really do want to fight with Israel. But to combat that problem is like, you have to get the UN on board. We've got to do an actual addressing of the Palestinian refugee problem, which is handled like a joke right now. Iran has to be brought to the table in terms of negotiations. There has to be huge efforts made to economically revitalize these like Palestinian areas, even though they're one of the highest recipients of aid in the world. You have to do something about the embargo and the blockade in the Gaza Strip, which isn't just maintained by Israel, it's also maintained by Egypt. You should ask why. Yeah, there's a lot of things that have to happen to fix that problem. But the reality is I don't think Israel really wants to, because they get to continue their expansion into the West Bank, and I don't think anybody around the world really cares that much.
So
in a month, we won't be talking about it.
I will argue with that. The idea that Israel does not want to end the conflict is belied by the history of what just happened with the Gaza Strip. So when we talk about settlements, for example, Israel did have settlements inside the Gaza Strip. There were 8,000 Jews who were living inside the Gaza Strip in Gush Katif up until 2005. They withdrew all of those people. I mean, took them literally out of their homes, and the result was not the burgeoning of a better attitude toward the state of Israel with regard to, for example, the Palestinian population in Gaza. In fact, it was more radical in Gaza than it was in the West Bank. The result was obviously the election of Hamas, the October 7th attacks, in which unfortunately many civilians took part in the October 7th attacks. There's video of people rushing, who are civilians and dressed in civilian clothing, into Israeli villages.
Not always the same thing.
Well, no, that is 100% true, obviously. And when it comes to Area C and Israel's supposed deep and abiding desire for territorial expansion in Area C. So for those who are not familiar with the Oslo Accords, and again, this is getting very abstruse, but the Oslo Accords are broken down into 3 areas of the West Bank. Area A is under full Palestinian control. That'd be like Jenin and Nablus, the major cities, for example. There's Area B, which is mixed Israeli-Palestinian control, where Israel provides some level of military security and control. And then there's Area C. And Area C was like to be decided later. It was left up for possible concessions to the Palestinian Authority if the Oslo Accords had moved forward. Those are disputed territories. There is building taking place in Area C by both, actually, no one talks about this, but by Palestinians as well as Israelis. And the question is whether, if Israel stopped building, there have been many settlement freezes in the past, including some undertaken by Netanyahu, and it actually has not done one iota of good in moving the ball forward in terms of actual negotiations. Again, the biggest problem is that the leadership for Palestinians has spent every day since really 67. It's not even 48, because between 48 and 67, Jordan was in charge of the West Bank and Egypt was in charge of the Gaza Strip. And at no point did either of those powers say, hey, maybe we ought to hand this over to an independent Palestinian state, which was originally the division that was promoted by the UN Partition Plan in 47. Because of that, the leadership post 67 and really starting in 64, the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 64, and it called for the liberation of the land. In 64, they had the West Bank and they had the Gaza Strip. So they're talking about Tel Aviv. When it was founded in 64, the basic idea, as kind of indicated by that, was Israel will not exist. And that was a promise that's been made by pretty much every Palestinian leader in Arabic to the people that they are talking to. Yasser Arafat famously would do this sort of thing. He'd speak in English and talk about how he wanted a two-state solution, and then he'd go back to his own people and say, this is a Trojan horse. And if Israel could, if you think that Israeli parents want to send their kids at the age of 18 to go and monitor Jenin and Nablus and be in Khan Yunis, you're out of your mind. You're out of your mind. Israelis do not want that. In fact, Israelis didn't want that so much that they allowed rockets to fall in their cities for full-on 18 years in order to avoid sending soldiers en masse back into the Gaza Strip.
True, but I think Israel does want to continue to expand settlements into the West Bank, right? They want to continue to build. They want to have Jerusalem, East Jerusalem as well.
Well, I mean, East Jerusalem has already been annexed. So East Jerusalem is, according to Israel, a part of Israel. That's not a settlement.
Sure.
Okay, so there's that. With regard to, does Israel have an interest in expanding settlements in the West Bank? Why would they not until there's a peace partner?
Sure, that's what I mean. But I'm saying as long as the conflict continues, like, because even when you talk
but your suggestion is that they're incentivizing the conflict to continue so they can grab more land.
Well, no, let me be very clear. I don't think there's like a plan. Like, So some people say, for instance, they'll take that one quote from Netanyahu and they'll try to say that like he was funding the people in the Gaza Strip by allowing Qatari money to come in, even though he was actually speaking in opposition to Abbas, allowing the Gaza Strip to fall for Netanyahu to clear it out for him, they give it back, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not claiming those theories. I'm just saying that I think that Israel would take a relatively neutral stance towards conflict enduring, because as long as the conflict endures and as long as the settlements can expand, I think that benefits. I think that ultimately benefits Israel.
I think there would be let's put it this way. If suddenly there arose among the Palestinians a deep and abiding desire for peace, approved by a vast majority of the population with serious security guarantees, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find Israelis who would not be willing to at least consider that in return for not expanding bathrooms in Efrat.
I would have agreed with you on October 6th. I think we're probably a year or two away from that right now.
But the point I'm making is that Israelis now realize that the entire peace process was a sham, meaning the people who are on the other side of the table were using it as a Trojan horse in the first place. The death of Oslo is not the death of Israeli hopefulness. It's the death of the illusion that on the other side of the table was anyone worth bargaining with. That's what's happening. And that's why you have this sort of insane disconnect right now between the United States and the Israeli government. Again, it's a unity government. No one in Israel is talking about making concessions to the Palestinian Authority for a wide variety of reasons, including the fact that Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah continues to pay actual families of terrorists who kill Jews.
Sure, the Mark Fund, yeah.
Right, and
which is from the moderate West Bank.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, again, like the taste in Israel for this is even the people who are the Chilonim, right? Those are the most secular people in Israel, which was, by the way, the place that was attacked on October 7th. I mean, what people should understand is that October 7th was not an attack against settlements in the West Bank. It was an attack on peace villages that were essentially disarmed. And many of these people who were killed were peace activists who were literally trying to work with people in Gaza to get them jobs. I mean, it's just, it's mind-boggling. That's why you've had this ground shift in Israel. The next 20 years in Israel is going to be about security and economic development, period.
That's such an interesting fact. I didn't realize it was like a peace village. Man, I feel like this conversation between Shapiro and Destiny is amazing, right? The back and forth in terms of two people who understand nuance and perspective, who have done so much research in their field and are kind of the two spearheads of like what we want in terms of like not all around. Like you don't have to be Jewish and religious, and you don't have to be Destiny in an open relationship. But in terms of how they handle politics, like Shapiro and Destiny are those guys. I know like people on the left don't like Destiny because he doesn't solely believe in the leftist cause, and people don't like Ben Shapiro because he doesn't solely believe in the rightist cause. It's unfortunate, but hey, my platform, we're trying to push that conversation forward.
End of story. Everything else goes second, third place.
And I will say I agree essentially with everything you're saying. Not to loop back on another topic, but this is one of the reasons then why I was so critical. I don't want to say critical, but like kind of nonchalant about the Abraham Accords, because they didn't address anything with the Palestinians whatsoever. They brought in countries that weren't super relevant to the conflict. They didn't bring in Qatar, which is where a lot of the money and support for the Gaza Strip comes from. They didn't involve Iran at all. They involved bilateral.
No, but it totally changed the mentality. And this is why what I'm seeing right now. This is why. Listen, I think that Biden has done better than I certainly expected him to do in terms of support for Israel. Like Obama was way less supportive of Israel than Biden by every metric. With that said, the rhetoric that he's been using recently and that Blinken have been using recently about Israel needs to make painful concessions for peace. Israel recentering.
I'm gonna have to skip it forward a little bit because I kind of get the sense of it.
Do you have a disagreement with you with what Destiny said?
My main problem with Biden's policy with regard to Ukraine is that he outsourced the end goal of the war to Zelensky early on. Now, that might make sense if that goal were something that he was willing to fund to the point of achievement, or if Zelensky could have achieved it on his own. But right now, and this has been true since pretty early on in the war, this point Henry Kissinger made, that pretty early on in the war, it was very clear that, for example, Crimea was going nowhere. The Russians had control of Crimea, barring the United States giving permission to fly F-16s over Crimea. Nothing was going to change over there. The same thing was true in most of the Donbass, right, in Luhansk and Donetsk. That was not going to change. Zelensky's stated goal, and you understand it, he's a leader of Ukraine, right, is that there was a predation on his territory in 2014, and that the Russians sent their little green men across the border, and then they took all of these areas. And so he, as the leader of Ukraine, is saying, okay, I want all of that back. Now, the reality is that the U.S.'s interests had largely been achieved in the first few months of the war, meaning the revocation of the ability of Russia to take Ukraine and just ingest it, and two, the devastation of Russia's military capability. I mean, Russia has just been wrecked. I mean, the military is in serious straits because of the war in Ukraine. From an American perspective, I'm very much pro all of that. I think that we have an interest in Ukraine maintaining a buffer status against territorially aggressive Russia. I think that the United States does have an interest in degrading the Russian military to the extent that it can't threaten the Baltic states or threaten Kazakhstan or other countries in the region. The problem I have with Biden's strategy is, as always, I think that it's a muddle, and I think muddles tend to end with misperceptions. War tends to break out and maintain because of misperception. Misperception of the other side's strength, the other side's intentions, and all of the rest. People misperceive what's going to happen. They say, I'll cross that line and nothing will happen, right? This is what Putin thought. He thought, I'll cross that line, they'll greet me as a liberator, and because the United States just surrendered in Afghanistan, essentially, they won't do anything, and the West is fragmenting because NATO's fragmenting and all the rest of this, and obviously he was wrong on all of those scores. The problem for Biden is that as with virtually every war, no end line was set. And so it became out recently, that it was widely reported that actually there was a peace deal that was on the table in the first few months that Putin was on board with, that basically would have ceded Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea to Russia in return for solidification of those lines, American and Western security guarantees to Ukraine, right? Ukraine wouldn't formally join NATO, but there would be security guarantees to Ukraine. We're ending up there anyway. It's just taking a lot more money and a lot more time to get there.
And do you think
And-
Trump would have helped
Fair,
push that
valid.
piece?
Yes, and I think that Biden actually did Zelensky a bit of a disservice because Zelensky knows where this war is going to end. It's not going to end with Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea in Ukrainian hands. It's just not going to, and he knows that. What actually, in my opinion, Zelensky needed was for Joe Biden to be the person who foisted that deal upon him so that he could then go back to his own people and say, listen, guys, I wanted all those things, but the Americans weren't willing to allow me to have all those things. And so we did an amazing job. We did a heroic job in defending our own land. We devastated the Russian military, even though no one expected us to. But we can't get back those things because it's unrealistic to get back those things because America, basically, they're a big funder and they're the ones who want the deal. Instead, what Biden said, and this was reported in the Washington Post last year, the Biden administration said, we're going to fight for as long as it takes with as much as it takes. And when they were asked until when, they said, whatever Zelensky says. And that's not a policy. That's just a recipe for a frozen conflict with.
I kind of,
maybe the Putin's walked away from
I
the table and that deal is
I
no longer
agree, to
available.
be honest.
If that deal
I
is
agree.
available right now, I certainly hope that's being pursued behind closed doors. My main critique again of Biden is that when you outsource the end goal to another country without stating what America's interest is, that's a problem. I also think that Biden did really quite a poor job of sort of explaining what America's realistic interests are. I don't like it when American leaders. It's weird for me to say this, but I'm not a huge fan of the "we're in it to protect democracy" kind of rhetoric. Because frankly, we are allied with many, many countries that are not democracies, and that's not actually how foreign policy works. We should, as an overall, 30,000-foot goal, advance democracy and rights where we can. But the reason that we were fighting in favor of Ukraine, and when I say fighting, I mean giving them money and giving them weaponry. The reason that we were doing that in favor of Ukraine is not because of Ukraine's long history of clean voting and non-corruption. The reason that we were doing that is to counter Russian interests in the region. I mean, it was a pure
Facts.
realpolitik
I've been saying
play.
that so
And
long.
that realpolitik play is hard
100%.
to deny no matter what side of the aisle you're on. I think that what many Americans are reverting to is we have no interest there. Why are we spending money there and not spending money here and that kind of stuff? And that argument can always be applied unless you actually articulate the reason why it is good for Americans beyond simply the ideological for the United States to be involved in a thing. So, for example, I think right now, when Biden is talking, I think that what Biden just did, the United States, as we speak, is striking the Houthis. I think that that's a really, really good thing. I think that's a necessary thing. I think American people should understand why that is happening. It's not because of quote unquote ideology. It is, I mean, on a very root level, but really it's because you're screwing up the straits. I mean, you can't do that. You can't screw up free trade. And Americans have an interest in not seeing all of our prices at the grocery store
Facts.
double and triple. Because
Man,
of a bunch of
Shapiro,
ragtag pirates,
I'm with you. I'm with
akin
you.
to the
I don't know
bribery
where
pirates of
Destiny
the
would
1800s
disagree
are
here,
bothering
so I'm
everyone,
curious.
right?
So Ben said a lot there. Do you disagree with any aspect on the Ukraine side?
A little bit, yeah. I think on the macro, I agree. Maybe we get into weasel a little bit on some things. On the final thing that he said, though, I wish that Americans could have honest conversations about foreign policy. I think that it would just be better for everybody. I don't know if it's, Red Scare after the Cold War, where it was like literally, the behemoths, we're fighting against communism. And we felt like after 91, every single foreign policy decision needs to be able to be explained in like 7 words. Like he's the bad guy and that's it. I wish we had more honest conversations about what our foreign policy interest is in a particular region.
I agree.
Because I don't think most
So,
Americans
to help
honestly
the
could even
people
articulate
understand.
why Israel would be an important ally, or why it's important to defend Ukraine against Russia, or why should we care about Taiwan at all. I don't know if most Americans could articulate anything there, even though they might have very strong opinions about why we ought to be involved in certain conflicts. So I do agree with that. I wish we had more honest conversations about foreign policy. In terms of how Biden has handled Ukraine, the things that I liked the most were, one, that he was very clear in the beginning about what we wouldn't do. So Biden saying that we're not going to do not a red line, no-fly zones over Ukraine. We're not going to be deploying troops on the ground in Ukraine. We're not going to be doing anything that would have, U.S. soldiers and Russian soldiers crossing swords with each other. That's not going to happen. I like that he made that very clear at the beginning. And I like that he coalition built between NATO and the EU to get people to send funds, training, soldiers, airplanes, and everything to Ukraine. I thought those two things were really good. In terms of basically writing Zelensky a blank check, I would like to hope that Biden and the entire United States learned a lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan that open-ended missions with unlimited budgets and no clear goal are like the worst foreign policy decisions you can ever do. They've like defined U.S. foreign policy for the past 2 or 3
I
decades.
think
which is unfortunate.
generally you agree. I think the disagreement is Destiny's extent in terms of Joe Biden's improve Joe Biden's role in terms of Ukraine and Russia. So I mean, overall, I think we all agree. To be honest, I mean, no disagreements here, man. Look at. If we had more conversations like Israel, Palestine, like there are like certain details that you disagree with, but the broad idea of Israel needs to kind of win the conflict. I'm not going to go into detail on what they should do. Ukraine should win the conflict. Like Ben Shapiro and Destiny agree to those sentiments, right? In terms of education, we want to change the family structure, and we want marginal improvements to certain programs for the betterment of the children. Destiny and Bench agree. Like, this is why these conversations are so important, because ultimately we all are trying to get to the same place. Like, unless you're like some weird radical, we all have similar, after having these breakdown conversations, we all have similar conclusions on the problems that we're talking about.
One
But
of the
January
big
6th, I'm
issues in
very
this presidential
interested.
election is going to be January 6th. It's in the news now, and I think it's going to become bigger and bigger and bigger. So, question for Destiny first: did Donald Trump incite an insurrection on January 6th, 2021?
Absolutely. This is probably ignoring every other issue we've talked about, of which I think there are plenty that I would say disqualify Trump from holding office. I think that the conduct and the behavior leading up to and including January 6th, I think is wildly indefensible. I am excited to see Ben try to, the 3 to 4 stages are the taking what I think any reasonable person would say knowingly false information about elections being rigged or ballot boxes being stuffed or Ruby Freeman, running ballots 3 times in Georgia, taking that knowingly false information and trying to call state secretaries and stuff to have them flip their electoral vote. That was horrible. The plot that Eastman hatched in order to have these like false slates of electors where all 7 states had citizens go in and falsely say that they were the duly elected electors that could submit votes to Congress. That was insane. That happened. Asking or begging Pence to accept these false states of electors initially and then just say you should just throw it out completely and throw it to the House delegation, which was majority Republican. That was absolutely unbelievable. And then on the day of January 6th, trying to capitalize on the violence by him, Giuliani, and Eastman making phone calls to senators and congressmen saying, well, don't you think maybe you guys should delay the vote a little bit? Don't you think they're just really mad about the election? I think he said to McCarthy, they're more upset than you. And his utter dereliction of duty in not doing anything to stop the rioting that happened on January 6th because he was too busy taking advantage of it. I think all of these things are horrible. I look forward to seeing the Jack Smith indictments play out in court, maybe even the Georgia RICO case. But yeah, I think all of these things are unfathomable. And I think when you look at the plot from start to finish, clearly the goal the entire time
Apparently,
was to
Trump has
circumvent the
to
peaceful
pay
transfer of power. That was the goal from start to
$83.3 million
finish, whether it was through false
due
claims,
to a
whether it was through
defamation
illegal
case. So
schemes, or whether it was through
one
violence
L
at the
on
Capitol
Donald
to delay the
Trump's case
certification
right
of the vote.
there, man.
Ben?
So I'm glad you're excited. It's always fun.
Uh-huh.
There are 2 elements to incitement of insurrection. One is incitement, the other is insurrection. So incitement has a legal standard. So does insurrection. Neither of those standards are met. So if you're asking me, morally speaking, did Donald Trump do the right thing between November 4th and January 6th? I said, I will continue to say, no, he did not. I think he was saying things that are false, with just factually false about his theories with regard to the election, about the election being stolen, about fraud. This was all adjudicated in court. He did not even bring
Okay.
any of the claims that he's brought publicly and all the rest of that. If we're talking about incitement of insurrection as a legal standard, it doesn't meet any of those standards. When it comes to incitement, it has to be incitement to immediate lawless action. That's the standard for incitement. And I'm very meticulous in how I use this because I happen to speak publicly a lot, and that means there are lots of people who listen to me, which means some of those people are probably crazy. And some of them may go and do a crazy thing. Did I incite them? The media tends to use the word incitement very loosely with regard to this sort of stuff, in the same way that Bernie Sanders, quote unquote, incited the congressional baseball shooting. He did not. Bernie Sanders has a lot of things I disagree with. I think Bernie's a schmuck. Doesn't matter. He did not incite that. So saying bad things is not the same thing as inciting violence. Inciting violence, the legal standard in the United States is, I want you to go punch that guy in the face. That's inciting. With regard to insurrection, typically in insurrection, and there are some descriptions in case law, though none in statutory law, as far as I'm aware, the typical description in case law is the replacement of one legitimate government of the United States with another by violent means. The notion that Donald Trump coordinated any such insurrection is belied by the FBI itself. The FBI put out a report in, I believe it was August of 2021, suggesting that there was no well-coordinated insurrectionist attempt coordinated by the White House. In fact, what you had was Donald Trump thrashing around like that weird alien in the movie Life. I don't know if you ever saw it with Jake Gyllenhaal, where he's like kind of thrashing up against this glass box, just an alien just thrashing up against the glass box. That I think is more what you were seeing from November 4th to January 6th. And then again, the claim that January
I feel
6th
like Ben
itself
Shapiro's a
was an
good guy,
insurrection.
man.
So
I'm just
virtually,
saying.
I'm not aware that anyone was charged with actual insurrection. There were some people who were charged with seditious conspiracy. There are insurrection statutes that do exist. No one was charged under those particular statutes. There were some people who you could say informally had insurrectionist ideas. Those would be the people who want to hang Nancy Pelosi or kill Mike Pence. And those people are in jail right now. And the election went forward. The election was certified. Mike Pence presided over the certification. Mitch McConnell presided over the certification. Joe Biden has been the president for the last 3 years. So Donald Trump, by the way, was still president at that point. If he had actively wanted to do what other people who have actually launched coups have done, he would have theoretically called the National Guard not to put down the riot, but to actually depose the sitting government of the United States in the name of a specious legal theory. He did not do that. He did not attempt that. Nobody working for him did that. The most you can say, I think, about what everybody was doing is that, and I want to say everybody. We can talk about Trump because this is really about Trump. He used a phrase that Trump was disseminating knowingly false information. The word that's carrying a lot of weight there is the word knowingly. So knowingly implies a knower. Do I think the information he was disseminating was false? Yes. Do I think that Donald Trump has a unique capacity to convince himself of nearly anything that is to his own benefit? Absolutely. And I think that that's actually what Donald Trump was doing there, and the evidence of that is Donald Trump being a human and all of us watching him for the last several years. So, the idea that he knew it to be false, I'm not even sure those standards apply in any and just assessing him as a human, which is really what we're being asked to do because there's an intent element to this crime. Does Donald Trump? Do you think that today Donald Trump knows that he lost the election?
Absolutely.
So I don't actually. I think.
But so I'm glad that you have the attorney background. When we are assessing mens rea, when we're looking at certain criminal statutes where intent is required, it's a reasonable person standard, right? Like, would a reasonable person have known that they were?
No, it depends on the mens rea standard. So it's not the same in every case. If you have to establish individual intent, then it's not enough to say a reasonable person should have known. That would be enough for a negligence statute. Usually, when you're talking about reasonable person statutes, just legally speaking, a reasonable person statute is should a reasonable person have known. That's when you get to manslaughter. You can't do a reasonable person standard on first degree murder. So you have to establish actual motive in first degree murder.
But for first degree murder, you don't need the statement of I plan to kill this person or I intend to kill this person. We can prove that state of mind.
You need
circumstantial evidence.
Correct. Yes,
yeah.
Sure. You could prove.
So I feel like my feeling for Donald Trump was there were all these people around him that he trusted to investigate election fraud. He trusted Barr and the DOJ. He asked Pence, his vice president, to look into it. He asked his chief of staff. He asked his legal counsel. He has so many people that ostensibly he trusts them if he's asking them to look into it. And when all of them looked into it and reported back to him, no, we found nothing. Unless we're going to literally make the concession that Trump might actually be a delusional psycho man, at that point, should he not have realized, well, okay, maybe that's
not. I think he should have realized the day of the election that he lost the election, but that's not. But that's
sure. But
I'm
saying that, at that point, should he not have known that for him to go and propagate those claims that he'd asked all of the people he trusted to research, and then for him to take those claims to Michigan and to Georgia, and then publicly and to try to convince people to throw out the election, you don't think that?
But you're doing the same thing. You're reverting to should a reasonable person have known? Yes, a reasonable person should have known. Did Donald Trump know? That's a different question. And so conflating those two questions is going to get you into some messy territory. By the way, this is why Jack Smith charged the way Jack Smith charged.
Yeah, which wasn't.
Jack Smith did not charge conspiracy. Jack Smith did not charge insurrection. He did not charge seditious conspiracy. Right? If the reason is because Jack Smith is a good lawyer. What he's doing is he's actually broadly, I would say, pretty obviously expanding statutory coverage in weird areas in order to cover a thing that doesn't quite fit into any of these legal categories. But the point that I'm making is that Jack Smith is on my side of this. He doesn't think that he can actually establish the intent necessary to convict under a seditious conspiracy or an insurrection.
I agree with that, but I think a lot of the underlying facts, though, because he does bring up those calls to Raffensperger in Georgia, he does bring up in the indictments that they were knowingly false information. So it seems like that's going to be part of the case, maybe not to convict on any of the four particular charges that he mentioned, but it seems like that's probably going to be part of what he's going to have to establish in court to convict Trump.
So I want to look at the actual text of the charges. So I'm sorry that I don't have them memorized, but I believe one's a fraud charge that generally does not apply to cases like this. Generally, the fraud charge is like you're trying to steal money from the government.
Sure, fraud has been used pretty broadly in the past, though. It doesn't have to just be, because Smith has done oral arguments in response to a lot of the claims by Trump's lawyers. This was one of them. The infinite civil and criminal immunity was another one of them, where he cites past cases where these types of things, because I think it was to defraud of civil rights, I think was the fourth charge.
Right, so the defraud of civil rights is usually somebody standing in the actual voting house door and preventing you from voting.
I'm sorry, I'm not saying anything. I'm just encapsulated with
should be thrown out
with this conversation, and it probably just seems like I'm glazing Ben Shapiro and Destiny right now, but they're actually having a very productive conversation. This is what I try to do on my podcast as well, have a very productive conversation about the topics that we're discussing, and they're really getting into the details in regards to Trump. I mean, for the most part, at the very least, there's a understanding that Trump's actions were dishonest and were terrible leading up to January 6th. The way he kind of thought the election was fraudulent, the way that he made people believe that the government was against them, all that stuff, terrible. The legal standard in terms of what is trying to be proven, I'm curious about that a little bit more in depthly. In terms of the moral standard, I mean, morally, I feel like Donald Trump was trying to do some terrible things. I mean, I'm going to put it that simply for you. Legally, I'm trying to figure out, okay, what standards, what charges are being brought out, and are they going to be met? Now, I'm kind of listening for that and that information, of course, because it seems like morally they both kind of agree in terms of Donald Trump's actions, but okay.
Yeah, although I don't like when we say specious legal theory and novel application, which I do agree some of these in some ways is novel, I don't think we've ever also had a president try to do this before. It is a novel situation where somebody has resisted the peaceful transfer of power this clearly in so many different ways.
Well, if you're talking about the legal cases, that's not true. But Gore sued in 2000. Right? I mean, if you're talking about the legal cases,
comparable to Gore, if this was comparable to Gore,
I'm not saying it's comparable to Gore. I'm saying that if the idea is that espousing a legal theory in court amounts to de facto some form of election denial or interference in some way, that can't. That's not, as a general principle, it's over-inclusive.
Sure. Gore wasn't trying to decertify the vote, though, for states, right? They challenged their thing to the Supreme Court. They lost their case in the Supreme Court, and then power transfer happened.
Right, and Donald Trump had a bunch of legal challenges, and then he had a rally, and then there was a riot, and then he left power.
Yeah, but the Eastman theory of what Pence could do in Congress is a far cry
A
away.
truly shitty theory. I mean, make no mistake. It's a
But not
really
just
shitty
shitty. I think that if any Democrat had done this, I think that I feel like we'd be looking at it in a far different lens. As in, we would be using terms like attempted coup, subversion, or peaceful transfer of power. If a Democrat vice president had tried to essentially say that in Congress they could throw away the vote.
So I think what I want to get to here, actually, so we can be more specific,
Sure.
is why are these terms important? We agree on, largely speaking, what happened. I think the characterization of the term, we keep kind of bouncing around between two different categories. And I want to make sure
we can dump
are we,
the legal stuff.
Okay,
actually,
okay, so we're just
not
talking
looking at incite because, like you said, Jack Smith, nobody's charging with incitement,
Right.
and I don't believe insurrection is part of it. So we're dumping legal. Just in terms of like a president that is trying to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. So we do call that a bloodless coup or a coup or whatever contemporaneous term you want to use.
Right. So prevent the peaceful transfer of power
Yes.
with all means, or using means that are inappropriate, not quite the same thing.
Using
Meaning
means that
means
are inappropriate or illegal.
Okay. Inappropriate. Okay, so illegal, I don't think so. I don't think that these charges actually meet the criteria for the various charges, and we can discuss each case if you want.
Sure.
As far as inappropriate, sure, I think tons of inappropriate stuff. I mean, inappropriate seems
The reason I don't
not,
like the word inappropriate, though, is because then conservatives are very quick to say, well, sure, he was inappropriate, but everybody was inappropriate.
I mean, I'll concede that he's more inappropriate than others. I just don't see
the
that
most
as-
inappropriate.
Sure.
Okay.
I mean,
That's
like-
important to me, though. Does it not bother you that, like, Donald Trump sought through
Okay.
legal and extra legal and Trump magical ways of trying to entrench his power as president past when he should have been able to? Is that not something that is incredibly troublesome?
I mean, the question to me is the bigger question that I think the Democrats are trying to promote in this election cycle, which is this means he is a threat to democracy sufficient that if he were to win the election, there would not be another.
Is
He
that
is
not?
such a-
But he
and my
tried
answer
to
to
do that
that is-
last time. Could he not try to next time?
And I mean, he could try to do whatever he wants, presumably, and he would fail the same way that he did last time
Why do we think that?
because he failed.
Because so
Because
he
there was
failed
a
once
riot
and
and
never
within 3
succeeded.
hours. Yes.
Like, let's say hypothetically, Lord, save me. Let's say hypothetically, Giuliani was the next head of the Department of Justice. Giuliani was the next Attorney General.
How would he be confirmed?
I'm not entirely sure if because so much of the Republican Party, despite feeling like they don't support Trump when it comes time to actually back him in Congress.
Also, I'd have to check
um,
whether he would be barred by criminal conviction from holding. I don't know the answer to that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, yeah. We're this, especially the 14th Amendment. We're figuring out all
Right.
of this right now. Yeah. But I mean, like, say if not Giuliani, say if there are any other number of insane people that Trump could theoretically put on his side of the government that wouldn't tell him no next time, because there were a lot of people that rebuked him. There were Republicans in a lot of the states. Right. Raffensperger is one of them. There were Republicans in his own administration. You've got Rosen.
Right.
You've got Barr. There was his own vice president. But like theoretically next time, and I feel like last time going in, I'm going to do a little bit of mind reading macro. Maybe you agree, maybe disagree. I think that Trump kind of thought, one, I don't think Trump knows much at all about how the government works. I think we probably agree with that. I think Trump probably thought that if he had people that were like at least in his party and kind of camp, that they'll basically do whatever needs to be done to give him what he wants, and with no respect for process. But now that he sees that, well, it's not enough to just have allies. I need people that are fiercely allegiant to me. Would we not be worried that a guy that tried to essentially steal the election for real wouldn't try to pick people that would be more amenable to his plans in the next administration?
I believe in the checks and balances of American government. I believe they worked on January 6th. So if you're asking me, do I think that Trump has bad intent or could have bad intent with that sort of stuff? Sure. Do I believe that the guardrails held and will continue to hold? Also, sure.
So
I hear what Ben
somebody
Shapiro's
is right.
saying.
and they blatantly said, like, I don't want to use the fascist word, but they said, like, I want to be an authoritarian. I'm going to abolish all elections. You would say, sure, he's saying that, but like, I don't think he can actually do it. So it's okay if he runs for president. You don't care at all as long as you feel like the guardrails.
I mean,
are
I
there
might
to
prefer
prevent-
other candidates, but I think that also one of the things that you do is that politicians, again, this would be an exceptional circumstance, but politicians constantly make promises about the things that they are going to do and then don't fulfill, and we tend to take those out in the wash. Meaning that, if I promise that day one, as Donald Trump has pledged to do, that he's going to deport literally every illegal immigrant in the country, do I think he's actually going to do that? I mean, I really highly doubt it. He didn't do it last time he was in office. That's just, there are many examples of this.
I agree.
Do I think, here's my question. Do you think the guardrails are going to fail to hold?
I'm not sure.
Really?
Yeah, because I think the issue is one, when it's election time, Republicans are spineless in office, and I don't know how many congressmen would support what he wants just because they want to win re-election or because they think it's inevitable anyway.
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things that happened in 2022 is Democrats ran directly on this platform, and a bunch of Republicans lost who were running on this platform. Literally every Secretary of State who ran on the Donald Trump "we should deny elections" platform lost in every state.
Sure, but other
A great way
Republicans
to
that
lose
have been
local office is this.
Sure, but I mean, like, look at what happened with like Kinzinger and Cheney, right? Who were very like staunchly anti-Trump after J6 for that select committee, right? Kinzinger didn't even run again, and Cheney lost her election by I think the widest margin that anybody has ever lost an election ever in
Right,
history,
yeah,
like all of U.S. politics.
People who were not yet born voted against.
Yeah,
her, yes.
I guess it's a surprising position to me if we're looking at like principled stances of government. The idea that a man who has
It seems
and
like
I
the
think
vehement
we both
disagreement
agree
in
on
terms
this,
of
Donald Trump's only allegiance is to Donald Trump.
accepting
right? We agree on this. The only
a
thing he cares about is
candidate
Donald
Trump's the
that
only thing he
undermines
cares
the
about is the largest-
It's the
democracy
largest thing he cares
versus
about, right? So you've got a man who only cares about himself.
Welcome
not
to
even-
politics.
the
I mean,
value
maybe
of the
more-
checks
but
and
that's not even-
balances
maybe
doing
more with
its
Trump, but
job.
Certainly not unique
But
to Trump.
I think that the issue with Trump too, though, is think he's even a threat to the Republican Party, in which I think you would mostly agree with me. Maybe not overall, but on every individual point, Trump picks bad candidates. He has no concern for the future of the Republican Party. Like, for instance, I think there is a chance. I don't think it'll happen because of the polling looks now. But if Trump didn't get the nomination, I think Trump would say screw it and run as an independent because he thinks he can win or whatever, right?
I doubt that he would do that, but theoretically,
Possible,
he could.
yeah.
I mean, again,
He was really content to throw Georgia, the 2 runoff elections under the bus because Raffensperger didn't support him for the election.
So,
stuff. Like,
what is all this in service of? What's the generalized argument you're making? Do
Wokeism.
you
Oh, there's
believe-
still so much
I'll go
content
back to my
left.
Yeah,
question.
the
Do you think that
generalization-
if Trump wins, there will be no more elections? Is that like what
I
put a
don't know
percentage
if-
on it? What percentage do you think that that's a reality?
if,
That
if Donald Trump
becomes
wins,
president-
I think there is a 100% chance that he will try to prevent the peaceful transfer of power. In terms of would he succeed?
I can guarantee you he will not do that
Why is that?
because he's in his second term and he's no longer eligible, and he will believe he won. He will leave.
Yeah, but hasn't Donald Trump himself joked about running for a 3rd term?
That's
I think that having a 3rd term.
what has Donald Trump not joked about? I mean, for God's
I don't.
sake.
Okay, hold on.
If
Wait,
you want
here's
to prevent him from creating a revolution, you probably should
Sure.
actually just appoint him president and then he
Here's,
can't
a,
run again.
here's another broad argument that I don't like in favor of Trump, and this was brought up earlier in terms of like we talk about like not grading presidents on a curve, but then earlier we said we take Biden's rhetoric.
Oh no,
more
I totally
seriously
grade
than Trump's.
No, I 100% grade presidents on a curve. Are you kidding?
Oh, okay.
I grade pretty much everybody on a curve.
Then I feel like
I don't treat my 7-year-old
I
the
feel
same way
like-
that I treat my 9-year-old.
Sure, but
Now
I don't,
treat Trump
I
the
don't
same way I
like
treat
that
Obama.
it feels like we're treating Donald Trump like a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old. I think we should treat him like the president of the United States. I don't think having a president that has taken like concrete steps to prevent the transfer of power, which he did with the electorate sham, which he did with Pence, and which he did with trying to capitalize on the J6 violence, a president that's taken concrete steps towards cooing the government, essentially. I don't know why that guy, we'd say, well, it's Trump, he does Trump things. The guardrails held, I'll probably hold next
So
time.
I mean,
Let's throw him in.
when we say we shouldn't,
Yeah,
you mean that
I'm
he should
curious
be
on.
actually barred from office.
I'm just talking about support for him. I don't even think Republicans should support Trump. You lose your incumbent advantage. The guy's obviously self-destructive. He's destructive to the political party itself. Like,
Do you think he should be on the ballot? You think there's a case to be made to remove him from the ballot?
I think there's a case to be made, but man, the phrasing, for as much as our governmental founding fathers and everybody else, wrote nice amendments and wrote nice in the Constitution, some of the phrasing is very, very, very bleh. And the Section 3, the not requiring any type of actual conviction, I don't have a strong feeling on it. I will say I'm very interested in reading the majority opinion from the Supreme Court. I seriously doubt the Supreme Court is going to uphold that states should be able to decide if they leave him off the ballot or not. I think for the political future of the United States, it's probably not healthy that the leading opposition candidate is now going to be barred from the ballot. It's probably not healthy for us because then what?
You want to talk about threats to democracy? That would be a pretty serious one. Applied
It
across
would,
the board, by the way.
it would be, however, like that threat to democracy was earned by Donald Trump and the conservatives that supported him. I think conservatives made a
Okay, I'm big when it comes down to these conversations, like precedent. What precedent is being set depending on the conversation? The precedent of a leading political candidate for a party being barred from a ballot depending on circumstantial situations, right? Having the ability to remove candidates from the ballot could open a can of worms, and that does give a lot of power to the state and federal government. I can see the concern. I can see the concern because once you do it the first time, it's like, oh, he did all these extreme things. Someone later on down the line is like, well, he did these things that is not nearly as bad as this, but still pretty bad. And then you just lessen the threshold potentially. Or the way you navigate the details can make certain activities in the past worse than they are in the present, if that makes sense. Interesting.
dangerous gamble when they threw Trump into office, and now like all of the fallout from that is something that we all as Americans have to deal with.
I mean, I think that the unprecedented legal theory that a state can simply bar somebody from the ballot on the basis of, in an informal way, believing that he is quote unquote an insurrectionist is pretty wild. I mean, that
we can say it's pretty wild, but there is an amendment in the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, that says that if they have engaged in this, they shall not be, or you shall, I don't remember the phrasing because it doesn't require conviction, but it's a self-executing, arguably thing.
If we're getting into constitutional law, I mean, there are a number of provisions that suggest that this is, number one, not self-executing. I mean, minority opinions in the Colorado Supreme Court case are pretty thorough. The number one contention, which is that this is not self-executing because other elements are not self-executing, that ignores subsequent actual law that happened. I mean, the Congress passed a law, for example, in 1872 defining who was an insurrectionist, who was not an insurrectionist for purposes of elections. In 1994, Congress passed a law that specifically defined insurrection as a criminal activity so that somebody could theoretically be convicted of insurrection and therefore ineligible to run for office. It is unlike, say, the analogs that are used by the majority opinion, like age. Obviously, this is not the same thing. we can all tell what somebody's age is by looking at their birth certificate. I can't tell whether somebody's an insurrectionist without any reference to a legal statute or a definition of the term.
I would also be careful with that because
Yeah.
one of Trump's first big political actions was challenging Obama's birth certificate.
Well, and I thought that was dumb at the time. But
Sure.
in any case,
I like that you both said 100% chance that Trump will try to go for third term and 0% chance, which
third
statistically.
term, he's done, man. Are you kidding?
He would want to.
Trump's going to walk around hands up high. He's going to be like, I'm a 2-term president. I'm the only president since Grover Cleveland but since Grover Cleveland who served 2 non-consecutive terms. I kicked Joe Biden out of office and I kicked Hillary Clinton out of office. Dude would be like, he'd be living large. Are you kidding? He doesn't want the presidency anymore after that.
I just think that I think it's scary that like Donald Trump, it feels like for all of the accusations that are made sometimes against Democrats, like Biden is ordering Garland to investigate Donald Trump and blah, blah, blah. It seems like Donald Trump would actually do that with his DOJ, would give them orders.
He didn't. He didn't.
Well,
he
kind of did though, right? So for instance, with Jeffrey Clark went to Rosen and Donahue and said, hey, listen, I need you guys to sign off on a letter that we're going to use essentially to bully states into overturning their elections by saying we found significant election fraud. And part of that threat was Jeffrey Clark saying, listen, if you're not going to do it, Rosen, Trump's going to fire you and just make me the acting attorney general. That was the threat that he carried. And I think Trump repeated that threat in a meeting later on that was, I only rebuked when I think like half the White House staff said, if you do this, we're resigning.
Okay, so that's a slightly different topic because now you're getting into all the election shenanigans and all this, but
Trump saying he threatened to fire his acting attorney general if he wouldn't carry the same platform, essentially. Like, if Trump could order his DOJ to do something, would he? It's not beyond the pale for him, right?
It's not beyond the pale for him to order them to do it, and then it's not beyond the pale for them to reject him doing that, which is the story of his entire administration. Whereas Joe Biden orders his DOJ to do things, and then they just do them.
Well, I'm not. We can get into specifics there. This
is one of the big problems that I have with, I mean, for example, all the talk about Trump tyrant, Trump executive power. I mean, Joe Biden has used executive power in ways that far outstrip anything.
Every president has been stretching executive power.
I mean, Joe Biden is going Joe Biden has gone well beyond anything Trump even remotely attempted to maintain via just pure executive power. And actually, Trump's use of executive power is nowhere near even what Obama's was.
I mean, Trump's inability to get border policy passed literally had him using executive power to march the military down to the border to do border policy. I mean,
Joe Biden literally used the Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration to try to cram down vax mandates on 80 million Americans. That's insane.
Sure,
he literally said, I cannot relieve student loan debt, and then tried to relieve hundreds of billions of dollars in student
loan debt. Yeah, but what
happened
to that?
It got struck down by the Supreme Court, and then they still did it. Biden bragged about it.
For what he was able to relieve, which I think were related to particular types of student loan debt. But I'm just saying that the guardrails are holding with Biden as much as they're holding with Trump. The only difference is that once Biden exhausts his executive
wokeism, I don't really care about the wokeism conversation. I think both of them understand wokeism has been annoying as hell. Institutional capture. I'm curious
such
about
that
this
today, when I'm reading stuff, and I know Ben is the same way, like if I even hear somebody say the word like anti-racism, I'm probably ignoring every other thing you have to say. If you utter the word like colonial anything, I'm probably going to say you probably don't have anything good to say. Yeah, a lot of it is just taken way too far. But you know what I will blame on some of this is I will blame conservatives for some of this. Because I think one issue that happens, and I think Ben might even agree with me here too, is I think there's two huge problems that have happened in the United States, I think broadly speaking, is that one, we become more different than we ever have been, and two, we become more similar than we ever have been. And when I say this, what I mean is that we're splitting off into these groups, and then these groups are enforcing this insane homogeneity between these two separate groups.
Yes, I've said this constantly.
And conservatives' reluctancy to participate in things related to higher education. So for a long time, conservatives are saying the educational institutions are against us.
I agree to that. Anything else? We'll wrap it up with these the final things.
As we approach the end, let us descend into the meme further and further. Ben, you're in a monogamous marriage. Destiny, you've been mostly in an open marriage until recently. How foundational is monogamous marriage to the United States of America? Can open marriages work? Are they harmful to society? Ben.
Marriages are the single most important thing that people can do in the United States because the things within your control are easier to control than things outside your control. People tend to think about big political change, obviously, about things they can do to change the entire system. But the reality is the thing that you can do that best changes society is to get married and have kids and raise your kids responsibly. That is the single best thing that you can do. Can an open marriage work? I mean, I think that depends on your definition of work. So in my version of work, the answer is no, because what you actually need in order to facilitate the healthy growing of a child is a father and mother who are committed to each other. All ideas about there being no emotional component to sexual activity are completely specious. That it is truer for men than it is for women, but it's not true for either. The idea of a full commitment to a human being with whom you genetically create children, which is typically how we've done it throughout human existence, is in fact the fundamental basis for any functional civilization. It allows for the transmission of culture and values. It allows for the transmission of beliefs and responsibility, and it gives the great lie to both the communitarian lie and the atomistic individualist lie. The communitarian lie is that you belong to the giant community of man, which is not true because you have a family, and your allegiance should be and is naturally to the members of your family first. That's how we learn, and then we expound that out. And it also is a lie to the notion that we are all atomistic individuals with no responsibilities. We are born into a world of responsibilities. Everyone is born into a world of responsibilities and rules and roles, and those are good. And if we do not actually socialize our children that way, there will be, number one, no children. Number one, there will be no healthy children. Number two, there will be no healthy children. Number three, there will be not the foundation for either social fabric, which is the real
Fair.
glue that
Yeah,
holds together
fair.
society, or for a functional government.
I'm
So,
pro
yes, yes,
family.
monogamous
I'm pro
marriage.
family.
I'm a fan. 15 years married, 4 kids. Yes.
Destiny, what do you think?
I think that when we talk about like relationships or marriage, I think something that's really important is we have to talk about whether or not children are being discussed or not. Because I think once you introduce the child aspect, I think the style or the type of relationship that you do is going to become way more important than whatever exists prior to that. Like I would agree, for instance, in terms of what Ben is saying, that there's probably going to be some structure that is ideal for the care and the raising of a child. I think that having a child gives you a much bigger buy-in to society, because now all of a sudden you care about a lot of things that you might not have before, because not only do you exist in society, you can't just run. Now you've got a child that exists there, and you've got to ensure that everything functions smoothly, not just for you, but for that child as well. And
Agreed.
arguably, although we're getting into weird places, I guess, in the world now, like children are the primary conduit for like where you transmit like cultural values and everything. The one kind of weird
Agreed.
thing that we're coming up against, that we have been coming up against now for some number of decades and will continue to, is as societies progress, it seems like people are having less children. And I actually don't know 100% what the answer is to that question.
I do.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah. I mean, an implementable answer that works, that we know we can get everybody on board with. It seems like for a large part of human history, having children, and it still is, having children is awesome, and children are cool, and children are magical and miraculous, and all of this. But you didn't really have much competing for your attention to have a child, right? When you hit a certain age and you started working, especially if you were a woman, I mean, childbirth is kind of the next step, and then having a family, raising your children, and then doing that is kind of the next step. Nowadays, especially with women being able to work, especially with women having access to birth control, there's a lot available in the world that's competing for the interest of people that could otherwise be having children, such that we've almost flipped it, such that, has been brought up earlier, like wealthy people tend to have less children than not wealthy people, or unless you're part of particular religious communities that push childbirth a lot. I don't know if I would say there exists a moral imperative on an individual to have children. I think that there's a lot of interesting arguments down that path. I don't know if we're quite at the point yet where we need to say like, oh my God, we're running out of people, we need to have more kids. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we are seeing, weird demographic trends that are having big impacts on how countries are playing out. For instance, the fact that we have a disproportionately huge aging population that needs to be taken care of with medical expenses and everything, that vote in different ways than our younger population, and that when they die off, like the way that society is going to look is going to be a lot different. Yeah, I don't actually I'm not entirely sure what the future is going to look like in terms of pushing people to have kids when every single industrialized country, as they become more industrialized, have fewer and fewer and fewer children.
Rapid fire questions.
And the answer, my answer was go to church.
Religion, yeah, I figured.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk about religion, but that's not rapid fire at all. Let me ask, this is from the internet. Does body count matter?
Jesus Christ. You're really bringing up the red pill.
I agree with a lot of what Ben Shapiro said. I'm not religious, but you do have to create your own cultural values somehow. In terms of Destiny, in terms of the current state of relationships and forming unions, it's much more difficult to create relationships nowadays than before, which probably plays into the part in terms of less people getting married because there's no really incentive. You're both working. You have to less people are meeting because of online dating, and people are kind of less socially active like on a normal basis. The easiest way for you to kind of gain a relationship is at the workplace or at school, or like honestly those two things. And if you work from home like I do, and obviously if you're not in school anymore, it's like, okay, where are you going to meet someone? The shut-ins, the one that stay inside all day, where are they going to meet someone? And because of online dating, because of women with like less wealth and success having higher standards, it definitely has changed the ability to gain or be in fruitful relationships.
Stuff.
Are you avoiding answering?
I mean, it depends on who you are.
Oh,
if you're somebody that doesn't
depends.
care about it, it doesn't. If you're somebody that does care about it, yeah, it does, of course. Depends on the
The answer is yes.
Okay. Should porn be banned?
no.
All right, rapid fire. I'm just gonna give yes or no. Does body count matter? Yes. Should porn be banned? No.
If you could do it, yes. There's no benefit to pornography. It's
Is
a
it-
waste of time and destructive to the human soul.
I can't believe I'm asking this question. Is OnlyFans empowering or destructive for women?
Jesus, these are rapid fire.
Yeah, just you.
I mean, it's
Wow.
probably empowering for the ones that are making a lot of money off it. It probably feels disempowering for others that feel affected by the cultural norms set by women that do OnlyFans. There's my rapid fire
Destructive.
answer.
It's
Destructive.
destructive to even the ones who are making a lot of money, because when you degrade yourself to being just a set of human body characteristics that other people jack off to, it's bad for you and it's bad for them.
Is rap music?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Involved on this? Or?
Have I evolved on this? So again, I'm going to go to what's the definition of music. My original argument about rap was that music involves the following three elements: rhythm, melody, harmony. Rap typically involves maybe one of those. There may be a melody, maybe sometimes. So it depends on the kind of rap. With that said, I could be convinced on this issue, but listen, I'm a classical violinist. I mean, that's how I was raised. I listen to Beethoven and Brahms and Mozart.
Ben
like,
Shapiro's
the
in a
car.
rap
So,
song. He knows
is it
rap is
comparable? Is it in the
music.
same category
Come
as
on
Beethoven,
now.
Brahms and Mozart? I have a very hard time sticking it in the same category as that.
He's a
All
rapper.
right, you're
Shapiro's a
both
rapper.
world-class debaters, even public intellectuals, if I can say that.
Jesus.
Yeah, I
I'm
know.
going real hard here.
I know. You both care about the truth. What is your process of arriving at the truth?
I think it's really important to, everybody will say that they're objective and that they are nonpartisan. I think it's really important to have mental.
I'm gonna let them have that. If you want to watch that, go to that pot. But I thought this was a very interesting, long reaction. I know, but this is just one of those I had to react to the entire thing. Interesting conversations, and it really kind of shapes. I'm not surprised that the conversation was as productive as it was, because these are two individuals that I think have the capacity to have progressive, not progressive in terms of the political ideology, but progressive in terms of moving conversations forward, types of individual to both Ben Shapiro and Destiny. They don't necessarily have to agree on all the little details, but there's some like overarching ideas that they came to a consensus about, which I appreciate. So I do hope you guys enjoy. Shout out Lex Friedman for having them on. Maybe one of these days I'll have Destiny on, I'll have Ben Shapiro on, I'll have Lex Friedman on. But the podcast is still going to be moving forward, publishing videos every single day and publishing the podcast episodes 3 times a week. We got a lot of interesting things planned, of course. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Y'all have a good one. Take care and peace.